Hello everyone, welcome to my new channel. I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. The day after Christmas should be one of quiet joy, a day of leftover food and new toys scattered across the floor. For the Ramsey family of Boulder, Colorado, Christmas of 1996 had been just that. On the evening of December 25th, John and Patsy Ramsey, along with their 9-year-old son, Burke, and their 6-year-old daughter, John Benate, attended a festive party at the home of their friends, the Whites. They were, by all appearances, a picture-perfect family. John Ramsey was a 53-year-old successful businessman, the president and CEO of Access Graphics, a subsidiary of the major corporation Lockheed Martin. His wife, 39-year-old Patsy, was a former Miss West Virginia, a charismatic and dedicated mother who poured her energy into her children, especially her daughter's burgeoning career in beauty pageants. And John Benate was a star, a small girl with a radiant smile, bright blue eyes, and a cascade of blonde hair. She was already a seasoned performer, having won titles like Little Miss Colorado and America's Royal Miss. Her life was a whirlwind of dazzling costumes, makeup, and talent rehearsals. Around 9:30 p.m., the Ramseys left the party and drove the short distance back to their sprawling, 5-bedroom Tudor-style home on 15th Street. According to John Ramsey, John Benate had fallen asleep in the car. He carried his daughter inside and put her to bed, just as any loving father would. Patsy would later recall that the little girl seemed to be slightly awake, a small, almost insignificant detail that would be scrutinized for years to come. The house settled into a quiet, post-Christmas slumber, but the peace was an illusion. It was the last peaceful moment the Ramsey family would ever know. The silence was shattered at 5:52 a.m. on the morning of December 26. A frantic, almost hysterical voice reached the 911 operator. It was Patsy Ramsey. In a panicked and sometimes confusing series of statements, she reported that her daughter was gone. She screamed that she had found a note, a ransom note, and that her child had been kidnapped. The operator tried to calm her, to get clear information, but Patsy's distress was overwhelming. The call was chaotic. Then, in a moment that would become one of the case's most enduring mysteries, Patsy seemed to believe she had hung up the phone. But the line remained open for a few more seconds. In that brief window of audio, some analysts believe other voices can be heard in the background. A man's voice, believed to be John, saying something like, "We're not talking to you." A woman's voice, Patsy's, sounding distressed. And perhaps another, younger voice, a child's voice, asking, "What did you find?" This was contrary to the parents' statements that their son, Burke, was asleep in his room the entire time. The official transcript remains inconclusive, but the snippet of sound was the first of countless ambiguities in a case that would soon be defined by them. Just 3 minutes later, at 5:55 a.m., the first police officer, Rick French, arrived at the Ramsey residence. He walked into a scene that was not one of controlled crisis, but of escalating chaos. The house was not secured as a crime scene. This was the first and arguably the most devastating mistake in the investigation. John and Patsy had already called friends, and soon, people began to arrive. The Whites, the family they had celebrated with just hours before, came over. A victim's advocate and the Ramseys' minister were also summoned. Instead of a silent, preserved environment for forensic examination, the Ramsey home became a gathering place for concerned friends. People moved freely through the house. They hugged and comforted the distraught parents. Someone even wiped down the kitchen counter. Evidence was being trampled, moved, and irrevocably contaminated with every passing minute. Officer French and the initial investigators on scene focused entirely on the information they were given, a kidnapping. Their actions were guided by the centerpiece of the morning's drama, the ransom note Patsy said she found on the kitchen staircase. The note itself was one of the most bizarre and perplexing pieces of evidence in the history of modern crime. It was not a few hastily scrawled lines, as is common in such cases. It was an epic, stretching across nearly 3 full pages of a legal pad. And the pad it was written on was not brought by an intruder. It was from inside the Ramsey house. The pen used to write it also belonged to the family. Investigators would later find what appeared to be a practice draft of the note elsewhere in the house. The idea of a kidnapper pausing at the crime scene to compose and then practice a lengthy letter was, to say the least, highly illogical. The content was just as strange. The author claimed to represent a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. They demanded a very specific sum of money, $118,000. It was an oddly small amount for a wealthy family like the Ramseys. But it was not a random number. Investigators would soon learn it was almost the exact amount of the annual bonus John Ramsey had recently received from his company. This was inside knowledge. How would a random kidnapper, a member of a foreign faction, know such a precise and personal financial detail? The letter was filled with rambling, vaguely threatening language, referencing beheading and warning the Ramseys not to contact the police, even though Patsy had already done so. It was signed with a strange acronym, SBTC, which was preceded by the word victory. The meaning of the signature remains a mystery. Handwriting analysts from the FBI would later study the note extensively. They concluded that the writing appeared deliberately disguised. While they couldn't definitively say who wrote it, they were unable to eliminate Patsy Ramsey as the author. The note felt staged, theatrical, and profoundly out of place. Yet, for the first crucial hours of the investigation, it was the only map the police had, and it led them squarely down the path of a kidnapping for ransom. Back inside the house, the hours ticked by. The note had instructed the Ramseys to expect a call from the kidnappers between 8 and 10 a.m. Police attached recording equipment to the phone lines and waited. John Ramsey arranged to get the cash for the ransom. The friends and family who had gathered in the house tried to offer support, their presence further muddying the potential crime scene. The 10 a.m. deadline came and went. There was no call. The house, filled with people, was silent with anticipation and dread. The kidnappers, if they ever existed, had gone quiet. As midday approached, the belief that this was a standard kidnapping began to crumble. The lack of contact was abnormal. Around 1 p.m., Detective Linda Arndt, who had been at the house for hours, decided a different approach was needed. The initial search of the house by police had been cursory, looking for points of entry or exit, not for a hidden child. Detective Arndt turned to John Ramsey. She asked him and his friend, Fleet White, to conduct the top-to-bottom search of the home, to see if anything at all seemed out of place or unusual. John Ramsey started his search. He went to the basement. It was a sprawling, cluttered space with multiple rooms. He opened one door, leading to a small, windowless room known as the wine cellar. And there, the entire narrative of the day violently shifted. Lying on the floor was the small body of his daughter, JonBenet. She was wrapped in her favorite white blanket. Her mouth was covered by a strip of black duct tape. A length of white nylon cord was loosely tied around her right wrist. Another piece of the same cord was wrapped tightly around her neck. It was attached to a makeshift handle, the broken-off top third of a paintbrush forming a crude garrote that had been used to strangle her. The frantic hope for a kidnapping rescue died in that basement room. This was a murder, but in his moment of horrific discovery, John Ramsey made the investigation's second catastrophic error. Overcome with grief and panic, he did not back out of the room and call for the police. Instead, he knelt down, ripped the duct tape from his daughter's mouth, untied the cord on her wrist, and scooped her tiny body into his arms. He carried her upstairs, through the house, and laid her on the floor in the living room, wailing, "My baby." In that single, desperate act of a grieving father, the integrity of the most critical part of the crime scene was destroyed. Whatever forensic clues lay on or around JonBenet's body in the wine cellar, hairs, fibers, fingerprints, the precise positioning of the ligatures were now disturbed, contaminated, and potentially lost forever. The little girl who was supposedly taken by a foreign faction had been in the house the entire time, dead in the basement, just a floor below where 24 people had milled about for over 7 hours. The mystery of who killed JonBenet Ramsey had just begun, but the investigation was already compromised in ways from which it would never fully recover. The arrival of JonBenet's body in the living room transformed the chaotic scene of a supposed kidnapping into the stark, horrifying reality of a homicide. The house on 15th Street was no longer just a home, but a murder scene. Paramedics who were called to the location confirmed what everyone already knew. The 6-year-old girl was dead. The Boulder police, whose efforts had been focused on a non-existent kidnapper for over 7 hours, now had to pivot to a murder investigation inside a hopelessly compromised environment. The Ramsey family, including John, Patsy, and Burke, were finally escorted from the premises and taken to the home of a friend. Only then, far too late, was the house sealed and the methodical work of a homicide investigation begun. On December 27th, the day after her body was found, an autopsy was performed on JonBenet Ramsey. The findings were brutal and complicated, painting a picture of a violent, multi-stage assault. The official cause of death was determined to be asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. There wasn't one single cause of death, but two distinct, horrific injuries. The first was a massive blow to the right side of her head, which resulted in an 8.5-inch fracture to her skull. The coroner noted this injury would have caused severe brain damage and was powerful enough to have rendered her unconscious immediately, or even killed her on its own. The second cause was the strangulation. The garrote had been applied with significant force, leaving a deep furrow in her neck. The autopsy also revealed signs of a vaginal injury, indicating a sexual assault had occurred. And then, a crucial piece of evidence was found deep within her digestive system. In her stomach was a small amount of undigested fruit, identified as pineapple. This discovery directly contradicted the timeline provided by her parents. Both John and Patsy Ramsey had stated that JonBenét was asleep when they returned from the party and that she had not eaten anything before being put to bed. But the pineapple was undeniably there. This finding gained even more significance when investigators processed the house and found a bowl containing pineapple and milk on the kitchen table. Patsy's fingerprints were on the bowl, and the fingerprints of her 9-year-old son, Burke, were on the glass of milk. This suggested some kind of activity, a late-night snack, had taken place after the family returned home, activity the parents either forgot or chose not to mention. As forensic teams painstakingly combed through the now secured house, they began to assemble a collection of evidence that was as compelling as it was contradictory. It was a set of clues that seemed to point in two opposite directions at once. The murder weapon itself, the garrote, was a damning piece of evidence pointing inward, toward the family. The beige nylon core was common, but the handle it was tied to was unmistakable. It was the top section of a wooden paintbrush. The other, larger piece of the broken brush was found back in Patsy Ramsey's art supply tote, covered in her paints. The murder weapon was fashioned from materials found inside the home, but other evidence pointed outward, to a mysterious, unknown attacker. In the autopsy, a tiny drop of blood was found in JonBenét's underwear. When analyzed, it produced a DNA profile of an unknown male. This same genetic profile was later found under the fingernails of her left hand. The DNA did not belong to John, Burke, or any other male in the Ramsey family. It didn't match any of the police officers or first responders at the scene. When run through the FBI Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, a national database containing the DNA of convicted felons, there was no match. This was the profile of a ghost, an individual who would come to be known only as Unknown Male 1. It was the single most powerful piece of physical evidence supporting the theory that an intruder had entered the house that night. The intruder theory was bolstered by other finds. In the dust of the wine cellar floor, near where the body was found, investigators discovered a clear boot print. It was from a high-tech brand boot, a popular style, but it did not match any footwear owned by any member of the Ramsey family. And then there was the potential point of entry, a broken basement window. A heavy suitcase had been positioned directly beneath it, as if used as a step to climb in or out. However, this clue also came with a baffling contradiction. An officer examining the exterior of the window grate noticed a spiderweb, perfectly intact, stretched across a corner. It seemed unlikely that a person could have squeezed through the opening without disturbing that delicate web. The evidence continued to build on both sides of the ledger. Fibers found on the duct tape that had been placed over JonBenét's mouth were consistent with a red and black jacket owned by Patsy Ramsey. This was notable because Patsy had claimed she was still wearing the same clothes from the Christmas party the night before, and that outfit did not include the red jacket. Yet more clues, like a single pubic hair found on the blanket covering JonBenét, did not match anyone in the home. Faced with this mountain of conflicting information, the investigation quickly fractured along two competing theories. The first was the intruder theory. This posited that an unknown assailant secretly entered the Ramsey home, perhaps through the basement window. He subdued JonBenét, possibly with a stun gun too small. Ambiguous marks on her body were initially thought to be from such a device. He then wrote the elaborate ransom note as a diversion, sexually assaulted her, killed her, and left her body in the basement before slipping away unseen. This theory was championed by the Ramsey family and their defenders, who pointed to the male DNA as irrefutable proof. The police, following this lead, began the daunting task of investigating known sex offenders in the Boulder area, but found no immediate suspects whose DNA was a match. The second, and the one that the Boulder Police Department quickly came to favor, was the family theory. This theory held that there was no intruder. The crime had been committed by someone inside the house, and the kidnapping was a hoax designed to cover it up. The evidence for this was circumstantial but strong. The ransom note, written on their own paper with their own pen, demanding an amount tied to John's bonus, seemed far more likely to have been written by a panicked parent than a foreign faction. The murder weapon was made from Patsy's art supplies. The pineapple story suggested the parents were not being truthful about the evening's timeline, and the glaring lack of any signs of a forced entry, no footprints in the thin layer of snow outside the house, no disturbed vegetation, made the idea of a secret intruder seem improbable. A sub-theory would later emerge suggesting that the killing was accidental, that Patsy, or even Burke, had struck John Benet in a flash of anger, perhaps over the pineapple or a bedwetting incident, causing the fatal head wound, and that the strangulation and kidnapping scene were a desperate, botched attempt to hide the truth. As the Boulder police began to focus more intently on John and Patsy Ramsey, the relationship between the investigators and the victims' parents soured dramatically. Feeling they were being unjustly accused while their daughter's real killer was at large, the Ramseys retained a team of high-powered defense attorneys and their own private investigators. They refused to submit to separate formal interviews with the police for several months. This refusal to cooperate, which their lawyers would call prudent legal advice, was seen by law enforcement and a skeptical public as the behavior of guilty people with something to hide. The case exploded into a media firestorm unlike any other. The combination of a wealthy, prominent family, a murdered child beauty queen, and the lurid, mysterious details of the crime created a vortex of sensationalist news coverage. Photos of John Benet in full pageant makeup and glamorous costumes were broadcast around the world. The Ramseys were no longer just grieving parents. They were the primary suspects in a bizarre, high-society murder mystery. They were tried and convicted in the court of public opinion, while the official investigation struggled to find a clear path through the fog of contradictory evidence and a contaminated crime scene. The stage was set for a protracted and bitter struggle between the Ramsey family and the very people tasked with finding justice for their daughter. Years following the discovery of John Benet's body were marked by a cold war between the Ramsey family and the Boulder police. The investigation, in the public eye, seemed to have stalled, focusing almost exclusively on John and Patsy. The Ramseys, in turn, launched a public relations campaign, appearing in televised interviews to profess their innocence and accuse the police of bungling the investigation in a rush to judgment. The battle for the truth was being fought not in an interrogation room, but on television screens across America. Frustrated by the lack of progress and the ongoing refusal of the Ramseys to participate in separate, formal interrogations, prosecutors decided to take a different legal path. In 1998, they convened a grand jury. Unlike a trial jury that determines guilt or innocence, a grand jury's job is to review evidence in secret and decide if there is enough probable cause to bring formal criminal charges, known as an indictment. For 13 months, this panel of ordinary citizens sat in a closed courtroom and heard the darkest secrets of the Ramsey case. They heard from detectives, forensic scientists, handwriting experts, and friends of the family. They examined the autopsy photos, the confusing timeline, and the bizarre ransom note. Near the end of the proceedings, both John and Patsy Ramsey testified. Finally, in October of 1999, the grand jury reached its decision. In a stunning development, they voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey. The charges were explosive: 2 counts for each parent for child abuse resulting in death, by placing the child in a dangerous situation and permitting her to be cruelly punished, and for being accessories to the crime. After more than a year of reviewing the evidence, the grand jury believed there was enough to put the parents on trial. But then came another, even more shocking twist. The district attorney for Boulder County, Alex Hunter, refused to sign the indictment. He held a press conference and announced that he would not be filing charges against the Ramseys. His reasoning was that while he believed he could show probable cause, he did not feel there was sufficient evidence to prove the case, beyond a reasonable doubt, the much higher standard needed to secure a conviction at trial. The decision was met with widespread criticism. The grand jury, the only impartial body to have seen the full scope of the evidence, had voted to prosecute. But the district attorney had single-handedly overruled them. The indictment itself was sealed, its contents hidden from the public for the next 14 years, and the case was plunged back into a state of limbo. The new millennium brought no new answers. The investigation grew cold. In 2002, a new Boulder police chief, Mark Beckner, took over the department and publicly admitted that the initial handling of the case had been flawed, from the failure to secure the crime scene to the intense focus on the parents. But these admissions did little to move the case forward. For the Ramseys, life continued under a permanent cloud of suspicion. In June of 2006, Patsy Ramsey died after a long battle with ovarian cancer, going to her grave without ever being formally cleared in the death of her daughter. Just 2 months later, the case was ripped back into the international spotlight. A 41-year-old American schoolteacher named John Mark Carr was arrested in Bangkok, Thailand. He had been corresponding with a Colorado journalism professor, and in those communications, he had confessed to killing John Benet. The news exploded. For a brief, dizzying period, it seemed the case was finally solved. Carr was extradited to the United States in a media spectacle. He gave a bizarre press conference, professing his love for John Benet and claiming her death was an accident. But his story quickly fell apart under scrutiny. Carr's confession was filled with details that contradicted the established facts of the case. He claimed he had drugged the child, but the autopsy had found no drugs in her system. His narrative didn't align with the evidence of the crime scene. The final, definitive proof of his deception came from the one piece of evidence that could not lie. A sample of John Mark Carr's DNA was collected and compared to the profile of unknown male 1 inch from the blood in John Benet's underwear. It was not a match. Carr's confession was a complete fabrication, the fantasy of a deeply disturbed individual seeking attention. He was released, and the brief flicker of hope for a resolution was extinguished. The bizarre episode, however, served to re-emphasize the critical importance of that unidentified DNA profile. It was that DNA that would lead to the case's most significant legal development. In 2008, the Boulder District Attorney's Office, now led by Mary Lacey, was using more advanced DNA testing techniques than had been available in 1996. One of these was touch DNA, which can identify skin cells left behind when a person touches an object. When they retested John Benet's long johns, they found the same unknown male 1 inch DNA profile in multiple locations on the waistband. The evidence now suggested that the unknown male had not just left a drop of blood, but had handled the girl's clothing. On July 9, 2008, District Attorney Lacey did something unprecedented. She wrote a personal letter to John Ramsey. In it, she formally and completely exonerated the Ramsey family. She wrote, "To the extent that we may have contributed in any way to the public perception that you might have been involved in this crime, I'm deeply sorry." The new DNA results, she explained, convinced her that the evidence pointed solely to an unknown intruder, and that no member of the Ramsey family was involved. Despite this official exoneration, however, public suspicion never fully disappeared, and some investigators continued to explore theories involving the family. One such theory, which gained traction in later years, focused on the victim's brother, Burke. At 9 years old, he had been a potential witness, but some came to see him as a possible perpetrator. This theory suggested that Burke, perhaps in a fit of childish anger over the bowl of pineapple, had struck his sister with a heavy object, like a large flashlight that was found on the kitchen counter, unintentionally delivering the fatal blow to her skull. In this scenario, the ransom note, the garrote, and the entire kidnapping charade were a frantic, desperate attempt by John and Patsy to protect their only remaining child. Burke Ramsey has vehemently denied these accusations throughout his life, filing defamation lawsuits against media companies that promoted them. Today, more than a quarter of a century later, the murder of John Benet Ramsey remains an active but unsolved cold case. The Boulder Police Department insists the investigation continues, and advances in genetic genealogy, a technique that uses public DNA databases to build family trees of unknown suspects, offer the greatest hope for finally giving unknown male 1 inch a name. But for now, the case file remains open, filled with more questions than answers. Who wrote the impossibly long ransom note on a pad from inside the house? If it was an intruder, why take such a risk? If it was Patsy, what was she trying to hide? Why was the ransom amount $118,000, a number so personal to John Ramsey? What is the meaning of SB? When and with whom did John Benet eat pineapple in the final hours of her life? And what was the true motive behind such a brutal crime? Was it a bungled kidnapping, a sexually motivated murder by a predator, or a tragic family secret that was covered up in the most elaborate way imaginable? The truth of what happened in the quiet, sleeping house on 15th Street died with John Benet Ramsey in the basement, leaving behind only a collection of baffling clues and a legacy of unending speculation. Case 2. In the spring of 1951, on a rugged, heavily forested peak known as Browns Mountain in Spokane County, Washington, a young man disappeared. His name was Alvin Matlock. At 21 years old, he was a veteran of the United States Army, a man who had served his country and returned to the relative quiet of a secluded cabin. But the quiet would not last. One day, he was there, a familiar face in the sparse mountain community, and the next, he was gone. There was no farewell, no explanation, just an unsettling silence that fell over his small wooden home. And into that silence, whispers began to rush in. In a small, isolated community, secrets are difficult to keep, and the rumors about Alvin Matlock's disappearance spread like a contagion. They painted a picture not of a man who had simply left, but of one who had been forcibly removed. The story, as told in hushed tones between neighbors, centered around a clandestine affair. The victim, Alvin, was said to have been involved with a married woman named Jessie. It was a dangerous liaison in an era when such transgressions could ignite violent consequences. According to the prevailing gossip, Jessie's husband, a man named Bob, had discovered the affair. What followed was a confrontation, a violent clash between two men over one woman. The details varied depending on who was telling the story, but the core elements remained the same. There was a physical altercation, a brutal fight between Bob and Alvin. In the heat of the moment, the rumors claimed Jessie herself intervened. A gunshot was said to have ripped through the mountain air, and Alvin Matlock fell. One version of the story even suggested that he wasn't killed instantly, that he was wounded and cried out for help, only to be left to die. These were just rumors, but they were fueled by tangible observations. In the days immediately following Alvin's disappearance, local residents saw Bob, the husband, bearing the clear marks of a fight. His body was covered in bruises, a silent testament to a recent, violent struggle. The physical evidence on his own body seemed to corroborate the story of a brawl. When Alvin's worried mother, Marie Matlock, approached Bob directly to ask about her son, she was not met with concern. Instead, she was met with a story. Bob told her that Alvin had packed his belongings and moved away. He had gone to Alaska, he said, to start a new life. For the Matlock family, this explanation was, for a time, something to hold on to. The idea of their son impulsively seeking adventure in the far north was far less terrifying than the alternative whispered on the wind. They wanted to believe it. It was a plausible, if abrupt, departure for a young veteran. And so, for months, they waited for a letter, a phone call, some sign that he had arrived safely. But no word ever came. The first concrete sign of trouble, the moment when the family's hope began to curdle into dread, arrived with the Thanksgiving holiday in November of 1951. Alvin was a constant at family gatherings. He never missed a holiday. As the Matlock family prepared to gather for their Thanksgiving dinner, his absence was a gaping hole at the table. The day came and went, with no sign of Alvin. His mother, Marie, could no longer ignore the gnawing anxiety in her gut. The Alessa story was wearing thin. Driven by a mother's intuition, Marie Matlock got into her car and made the journey up Browns Mountain to her son's cabin. It was a remote place, a small structure surrounded by the dense woods of eastern Washington. As she arrived, the silence she found was profound. The cabin was empty. There was no sign of Alvin. More disturbingly, his vehicle was also gone. It wasn't just the man who had vanished. His transportation had vanished with him. The scene cold and desolate. It looked less like a home someone had left for a new life, and more like a place that had been abandoned in haste. The reality finally set in for the family. Alvin wasn't in Alaska. Something terrible had happened on this mountain. With this grim realization, the family turned to the authorities. However, the investigation by the local sheriff's department was handicapped from the very beginning. Months had passed since Alvin was last seen. The family's initial acceptance of the Alaska story had created a critical delay. Any potential evidence that might have existed at the cabin, fingerprints, blood, signs of a struggle, was long gone, erased by time and the element. Investigators had no physical evidence to work with, no crime scene to process. All they had were the same rumors that had been circulating for months. They looked into the story of the affair, the fight, and the alleged shooting. They questioned people in the community. The names Jessie and Bob came up repeatedly. But the wall of silence was formidable. In a small town, speaking out against a neighbor, especially one involved in something so dark, was a dangerous proposition. No official witnesses came forward to state they had seen a fight or heard a gunshot. And without a body, the rumors were legally toothless. This became the single greatest obstacle in the case, a legal principle known as corpus delicti, a Latin term meaning the body of the crime. In the 1950s, the legal system made it nearly impossible to prosecute someone for murder without the victim's body. The prosecution had to prove that a crime had actually occurred, and the most fundamental proof of a murder was the corpse of the person who was murdered. Without Alvin Matlock's remains, investigators could not definitively prove he was dead. let alone that he was killed by a specific person. The police may have had strong suspicions. The bruises on Bob, his immediate and convenient lie about Alaska, and the persistent rumors all pointed to him and his wife, Jessie. But suspicions were not enough to make an arrest. The investigation stalled. With no body, no witnesses, and no confession, law enforcement had nowhere to go. The case of Alvin Matlock's disappearance quickly grew cold. For decades, an agonizing silence followed. The official investigation was dormant. The family was left in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn, unable to find closure. Alvin's younger brother, Clyde Matlock, was only 12 years old when his older brother vanished. He grew up with the shadow of that mystery hanging over his family. He would grow into a man, marry a woman named Patricia, and carry the memory of his lost brother with him every day. The questions from 1951 remain unanswered, echoing through the generations. Where was Alvin Matlock's body? What exactly happened in that violent confrontation? And how could someone simply vanish without a trace? The forest on Browns Mountain kept its secrets, and for over half a century, it seemed that the truth of what happened to the young Army veteran was buried forever. For the Matlock family, the decades that followed Alvin's disappearance were a form of slow, unending torment. The world changed around them. The 1950s gave way to the social upheaval of the 60s, the uncertainty of the 70s, and the technological boom of the 80s and 90s. Children were born, grew up, and had families of their own. But for them, time remained frozen on a cold Thanksgiving day in 1951. With no body, there could be no funeral. With no answers, there could be no closure. The case file for Alvin Matlock gathered dust in a police archive, officially classified as a cold case, a puzzle with too many missing people. The emotional weight of this unresolved loss fell heavily on Alvin's younger brother. Clyde Matlock, the boy who was 12 when his hero, his older brother, vanished, carried the burden of that mystery throughout his entire life. But as time went on, a new champion for Alvin's cause emerged. It was Clyde's wife, Patricia Matlock. Though she had never met Alvin, she embraced his memory and the family's quest for truth as her own. She refused to let his story be forgotten, refused to accept that the whispers on Browns Mountain were the only epitaph he would ever have. In an era before the internet made information readily accessible, Patricia began her own painstaking, private investigation. She became the family's detective, driven by a fierce sense of justice for a brother-in-law she never knew. She spent countless combing through old public records, looking for any trace of the people involved. She tried to track down Jessie and Bob to see where their lives had taken them after 1951. She sought out elderly residents of the Browns Mountain area, hoping to find someone, anyone, who was no longer afraid to speak, someone whose memory might hold a key detail that had been overlooked decades earlier. Her efforts were a testament to the family's undying hope, a small light of persistence flickering in the vast darkness of the cold case. For decades, that persistence was met with frustration. But as the world entered the 21st century, the tools available to solve old mysteries began to change dramatically. On January 19, 2012, a significant step was taken. The case of Alvin Edwin Matlock was officially entered into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, or NAMUS. He was assigned a case number, MP-13670. After 60 years of being a local ghost story, Alvin was now a data point in a powerful national database, his profile accessible to law enforcement agencies and medical examiners across the entire country. Then, in July of 2016, the family took the most crucial step of all. Clyde and Patricia Matlock attended the first ever missing person event hosted by the Spokane County Medical Examiner's Office. There, amidst other families caught in the same agonizing limbo, they did something that was scientifically impossible in 1951. Clyde Matlock, Alvin's younger brother, provided a DNA sample. The simple swab of a cheek was an act of profound hope. His genetic material was uploaded to national databases, creating a permanent biological search party. Now, if any unidentified human remains found anywhere in the country shared a familial link to Clyde's DNA, they would get a match. It was the family's last, best hope of one day bringing Alvin home. But while the Matlock family was looking to the future of science for answers, a shocking breakthrough was about to come from the past, from a source no one could have predicted. The story's focus shifts to another family, and to another woman haunted by her own history. This woman's name was Leela. She was the daughter of Jessie, the very woman at the center of the rumors about Alvin Matlock's death. Leela grew up in a family shrouded in secrets, shadowed by a violence she couldn't understand. As an adult, she began a personal quest to uncover the truth of her own upbringing. Her investigation had nothing to do with Alvin Matlock. She was simply trying to make sense of her mother's dark and complicated past. Her journey led her to a horrifying discovery. She learned that her mother, Jessie, and her mother's family were not just troubled people. They were members of a notorious and violent criminal family known as the Klein Gang. This discovery recontextualized everything. The Klein Gang was infamous in the region, linked to a string of violent crimes, including armed robberies and potentially other murders. They were a ruthless, organized group who used violence as a tool of their trade. Suddenly, the disappearance of Alvin Matlock was no longer a potential crime of passion born from a simple love triangle. It was now potentially linked to a dangerous criminal enterprise. Leela's investigation uncovered more. She found that her mother, Jessie, had been a prime suspect in another, separate murder case. Law enforcement in Kellogg, Idaho, had officially identified Jessie as the person who had killed a man named Don Folkman. This was a critical piece of information. It established that Jessie, the woman rumored to have shot Alvin Matlock, was considered by police to be a killer in an entirely different case. It proved she was capable of lethal violence. For Leela, this revelation was earth-shattering. The vague, unsettling rumors she had heard her entire life about a missing man named Alvin Matlock suddenly clicked into place. They were no longer just small-town gossip. They fit a pattern of violence and criminality that she was now discovering was her own family's legacy. The story of a confrontation, a fight, and a fatal shooting now seemed terrifyingly plausible. This new information, uncovered not by police but by a suspect's own daughter, cast the events of 1951 in a chilling new light. The silence of the community on Browns Mountain suddenly made perfect sense. The locals weren't just afraid of a jealous husband. They were terrified of the Klein Gang. Speaking out against Jessie or her family could have been a death sentence. The lie that Bob told Alvin's mother that he had gone to Alaska was revealed not just as a simple cover-up, but as a calculated tactic by experienced criminals to misdirect and delay any official investigation, giving them ample time to dispose of the evidence. The scope of the case had now widened dramatically. Alvin Matlock, the 21-year-old Army veteran, hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had unknowingly crossed paths with a member of a violent criminal family, a woman who was already a suspected murderer. The question was no longer simply whether Jessie and Bob were involved. The question now was how deep the conspiracy. Had other members of the Klein Gang helped them? And with their history of violence and access to the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, where had they hidden the body of Alvin Matlock? The discovery of the Klein Gang connection, brought to light by the suspect's own daughter, fundamentally changed the narrative of Alvin Matlock's disappearance. What was once seen as a possible crime of passion was now revealed to be entangled with a web of organized, familial crime. To understand what likely happened to Alvin, we must look closer at the profiles of the two individuals who stood at the center of the storm, Jessie and her husband, Bob. Jessie was the primary suspect, and the information uncovered decades later painted a portrait of a woman far more dangerous than anyone in the small mountain community might have initially believed. Her documented link to the Klein Gang suggests that violence and illegality were not foreign concepts to her. They were a part of her world. The most damning evidence against her character was the conclusion by police in Idaho that she was the perpetrator in the murder of Don Folkman. This wasn't a rumor or an allegation. It was the official finding of a law enforcement agency. It established her as a person with the capacity and willingness to kill. Her potential motive in Alvin's case becomes more complex with this knowledge. A spontaneous act of rage during a fight is one possibility, but it's also possible that Alvin's death was a more calculated decision. Perhaps the affair had become an inconvenience, a threat to her marriage and stability that needed to be permanently eliminated. For someone embedded in a criminal culture like the Klein Gang, murder could be seen as a brutally effective solution to a personal problem. Her manipulation was also on display. She, along with her husband, participated in a cover story that successfully pacified Alvin's family and delayed a police investigation for months, a tactic that speaks to a cold and calculating mind. Her husband, Bob, plays the role of the essential accomplice. The bruises seen on his body by neighbors are the most compelling evidence of his direct involvement in the initial physical confrontation with Alvin. He was not a passive bystander. He was a participant in the violence that likely led to Alvin's death. His most critical role, however, was in the cover-up. He was the one who personally delivered the move to Alaska lie to Alvin's mother. This act of deception was the key that locked the door on any immediate investigation. It's unknown whether he acted out of fear of his wife and her family, or if he was a willing partner in the crime to protect his marriage. Regardless of his motivation, his actions make him complicit in the silencing of Alvin Matlock. The involvement of the Klein gang also helps to answer one of the most perplexing questions. How did all evidence of a person and their vehicle simply vanish? Disposing of a body in a car is a difficult task. For a criminal organization with experience in violence and operating in the vast, remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, it would have been a manageable, if grim, piece of business. It is highly probable that other members of Jesse's family were involved in helping to erase every trace of Alvin Matlock from the face of the earth. And so, even with this clearer picture of the suspects, the case remains haunted by profound, unanswered questions. The most pressing, of course, is where are Alvin Matlock's remains? Were they buried deep in the forests of Browns Mountain? Were they weighed down and sunk in one of the region's many lakes or rivers? Without his body, the full story of his final moments can never be known. What exactly happened that fateful night in 1951? Was the gunshot an accident during a struggle, or was it a cold-blooded execution? And what became of his vehicle? It was likely used to transport his body before being disposed of itself, perhaps driven into a ravine or dismantled for parts, another secret swallowed by the landscape. Today, the disappearance of Alvin Matlock remains officially an open, unsolved cold case with the Spokane County Sheriff's Office. No arrests have ever been made. No charges have ever been filed. The suspects, Jesse and Bob, are now presumed to be deceased, having taken the absolute truth of what they did to their graves. The legal obstacles of the 1950s, primarily the lack of a body, ensured they would never face a courtroom for their crime. The final hope for any resolution no longer lies in the justice system, but in forensic science. Somewhere in a national database, the DNA profile of Clyde Matlock sits and waits. It is a silent, digital vigil. It waits for a potential match with a set of unidentified remains, a John Doe found years ago on a mountainside or discovered recently by a hiker. A single match from that database would finally answer the first and most important question. It would not bring justice in the legal sense, but it would provide something far more valuable to the family. An answer, an identification, and the chance to finally bring Alvin home. The impact of this single, violent act has echoed through more than 70 years of one family's history. It left a mother to die without ever knowing what happened to her son. It left a younger brother to grow old under the shadow of a missing person poster. The absence of Alvin Matlock became a defining tragedy for his family, a wound that could never heal because there was no body to bury, no grave to visit. For the Matlocks, Thanksgiving, a day of gratitude and family, was forever transformed into a painful anniversary, a reminder of the empty chair at their table. The simple lie about a move to Alaska proved to be as devastating as the act of violence it was meant to conceal, robbing a family of answers and justice for generations. Alvin's story is a sobering reminder that for the families of the missing, the silence that follows is often the cruelest punishment. Case 3. In the years that followed, the aftermath of the tragedy continued to ripple outwards, but it was met with incredible strength and resilience. Jack's sister, Cheryl Brenneck, and her husband stepped in to raise the triplets, officially adopting them and providing them with a stable, loving home. They ensured the children were surrounded by family who would always cherish the memory of their mother. Cheryl, having been forced through a trial by fire in the justice system, transformed her grief into a powerful new purpose. She became a tireless and outspoken advocate for victims of domestic abuse, sharing her sister's story to raise awareness and push for change, ensuring that Jack's death would not be in vain. Her advocacy, along with the high-profile nature of the case, led to a tangible and lasting legacy. In 2018, the state of Missouri passed a new piece of legislation known as Jack's Law. The law was crafted to address the very vulnerability that Clay Waller had exploited. It mandates that in divorce and custody cases where there is a history of domestic violence, the exchange of children must take place at a safe, neutral, and protected facility. It prevents an abuser from using their children as bait to lure a victim to a private, unsafe location. The law also requires judges to give greater consideration to any history of abuse when making custody decisions. Jack's story had directly resulted in a law that would protect countless other vulnerable parents and children across the state. Looking back, the case of Jack Waller leaves behind several lingering questions. It serves as a stark reminder of how the system can sometimes fail to protect victims, even when they voice their fears and document the threats against them. It also contains the tragic, novel-like detail of the killer's confession to his father, confession that could have solved the case immediately but was lost to death and the rules of evidence. The initial plea deal, while controversial, is now seen in a different light. It was a painful, pragmatic choice that forced the family to trade a lengthy sentence for the certainty of bringing their loved one home. It was a decision rooted in love and the need for closure. The subsequent federal prosecution can be seen as the justice system correcting its own perceived failing, a rare second chance to impose a sentence that more closely matched the severity of the crime. Ultimately, the story of Jack Waller is a tragedy born from domestic violence. But it is also a story of a family's unwavering love, of a sister's relentless fight for justice, and of a community that refused to let a victim be forgotten. Her name is now attached not only to a horrific crime, but to a law that protects the vulnerable, a legacy of safety and hope that rose from the depths of profound loss. In the spring of 2011, Jack Sue Waller was on the verge of a new life. At 39 years old, she was a dedicated manager at Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Missouri and, most importantly, a devoted mother to a set of 5-year-old triplets, 2 girls and a boy who were the absolute center of her world. After years spent in a volatile and unhappy marriage, she had finally taken the difficult step to file for divorce. She had moved out of the marital home and was living in Genevieve County, Missouri, looking forward to a future she could build on her own terms, a future of peace and safety for herself and her children. To her friends and family, Jack was a vibrant and beautiful woman, with a radiant smile that hinted at the strength within. That strength was something she had been forced to rely on for years. Her estranged husband was James Clay Waller, a former deputy from the Cape Girardeau County Sheriff's Department. Their marriage had been defined by his control, his temper, and a pattern of domestic abuse that had left Jack feeling trapped and afraid. She had documented his behavior, writing down his threats in a private journal. They were chillingly direct. He told her that if he couldn't have her, no one could. He warned her that her decision to divorce him would be her death sentence. These were not the empty rants of a man in pain. They were the cold pronouncements of a man who saw his wife not as a partner, but as a possession he was about to lose. The divorce proceedings were contentious, particularly regarding finances and custody of the children. Still, Jack pushed forward, determined to finalize the separation and begin her life anew. On the last day of May in 2011, Clay Waller made a trip that had nothing to do with his job or his children. He took his boat out onto the powerful currents of the Mississippi River. He navigated to a remote, uninhabited landmass on the Illinois side of the river, a place known locally as Devil's Island. It was a secluded spot, accessible only by water, covered in sand and wilderness. There, with no one to witness his actions, he dug a hole. It wasn't a small hole. He dug for as under the humid sky, scooping out sand and earth until the grave was 6 feet deep. His task complete, he got back in his boat and returned to the mainland. That evening, he spent time with his new girlfriend. The hole on Devil's Island waited. It was a meticulously prepared space for a crime he intended to commit the very next day. June 1st, 2011, was the day Jack and Clay were scheduled to meet with their divorce attorney in Cape Girardeau to finalize the paperwork. The meeting was tense. They argued over financial matters, the final, bitter negotiations of a partnership that was ending in acrimony. After the meeting concluded, they went their separate ways. Jack believed the worst was over. She just needed to get through these last few interactions. Clay, however, had one last thing he needed from her. He called her and told her she needed to come to his house in Jackson, Missouri. The reason he gave was one he knew she couldn't refuse. He said one of their children was at the house, and she needed to come pick the child up. For Jack, a fiercely protective mother, her children's needs came before her own safety concerns. She drove her Honda Pilot to the house she had once shared with him. But when she arrived and walked inside, she found no child waiting for her. It was a trap. The house was empty, except for the man she was trying to assassinate. Sometime that afternoon, inside that suburban home, Clay Waller unleashed the violence he had promised for so long. He attacked his wife, beating her and then strangling the life out of her. Once Jack was dead, her husband's calculated plan continued to unfold. His first priority was to erase the crime. In the hallway of his home, he used a sharp blade to cut away a large section of the carpet that was now stained with his wife's blood. He hid the bloody remnant, intending to dispose of it later. He then began the grim task of moving her body. He transported her from his house back to his boat, the same vessel he had used the day before. Under the cover of the approaching evening, he once again made the journey across the Mississippi River. He piloted the boat to the secluded shore of Devil's Island, to the exact spot he had prepared. There, he placed his wife's body into the 6-foot grave and covered her with layers of sand and soil, burying her deep in the lonely wilderness of the island. He was confident that she would never be found. Back in Genevieve County, as evening turned to night, Jack's family began to worry. Her sister, Cheryl Brennick, knew about the divorce meeting. She expected to hear from Jack afterward, as they were very close. But Jack wasn't answering her phone. Calls went straight to voicemail. This was highly out of character. Jack was a responsible mother who would never just disappear, especially not without telling anyone where she was going or when she would be back for her triplets. The knot of fear in her sister's stomach tightened with every passing of silence. By the morning of June 2nd, the fear had turned into panic. The family knew something was terribly wrong. Cheryl Brennick officially reported her sister missing to the police. The investigation began almost immediately, and right from the start, there was only one person of interest. Given the history of domestic violence, the threats Jack had documented, and the fact that she was last known to be meeting with him, all eyes turned to Clay Waller. Later that same day, a discovery was made that seemed to deepen the mystery. A Missouri State Highway Patrol trooper found Jack's Honda Pilot abandoned on the shoulder of Interstate 55, near the town of. At first glance, it might have suggested a simple breakdown, but a closer look revealed a slashed tire. It was a deliberate act of sabotage. The car seemed to have been staged, left in a conspicuous place as a potential misdirection. A search of the area later uncovered Jack's purse, tossed away not far from the vehicle. To investigators, the scene felt wrong. It didn't look like a random carjacking or abduction. It looked like an attempt to create a false narrative. Detectives immediately sought to interview the husband. Clay Waller was calm, denying any knowledge of his wife's whereabouts. He claimed that after their meeting, they had argued, and she had stormed off. His story, however, was thin, and his demeanor was unsettlingly nonchalant for a man whose wife, the mother of his children, had vanished without a trace. Investigators didn't believe him for a second. They secured a warrant to search his home in Jackson. The search of the house yielded the first critical pieces of physical evidence. In the hallway, detectives noticed it immediately. A large, rectangular section of carpet and padding was missing, cut out with precision. The concrete subfloor was exposed. They located the missing piece of carpet, which the husband had hidden. On it, they found dark stains that appeared to be blood. Samples were collected and sent to the crime lab for analysis. The lab would later confirm that the blood on that carpet belonged to Jack Waller. There were also clear signs that someone had recently undertaken a frantic, widespread cleaning effort throughout the house. The evidence was circumstantial, but it painted a damning picture. A violent struggle had occurred in that hallway, and the perpetrator had tried, but failed, to scrub the evidence away. While the physical search of the house was underway, other investigators were looking into the husband's recent activities. They received tips that he had been seen meticulously cleaning his boat shortly after his wife's disappearance. This raised immediate suspicion that the boat had been used for something illicit. The Mississippi River became a focal point of the investigation. Law enforcement and volunteers began the daunting task of searching the vast river and its rugged shoreline. They searched by air, on foot, and in boats, combing through the dense woods and shifting sands along the riverbanks. But the Mississippi is immense, and Devil's Island kept its secret well hidden beneath the surface. For 2 long years, the searches would continue, fueled by the hope of a desperate family, but they would yield nothing. As the days turned into weeks, Clay Waller's behavior grew more brazen. He showed no signs of a grieving husband. In July, about a month after his wife's disappearance, he posted a direct threat online aimed at Jack's sister, Cheryl Brennick, who was relentlessly pushing the police for answers and keeping Jack's story alive in the media. This act of intimidation only reinforced the belief among investigators and the family that he was the one responsible. The FBI was brought in to assist local law enforcement. They began building a case against the husband, piece by painstaking. They knew he had killed her. They had evidence of a violent encounter in his home. They had a history of threats and abuse. They had his suspicious behavior after the fact. What they didn't have was a body. Without the victim's remains, any murder prosecution would be incredibly challenging. A defense attorney could simply argue that Jack Waller had decided to walk away from her life and was still alive somewhere. But the investigators had The FBI learned that Clay Waller had made a stunning confession to one of the few people he thought he could trust, his own father, James Waller. According to the information they received, Clay had told his father everything. He admitted that he had killed Jack, breaking her neck. He even described how he had buried her, placing her in a hole he had dug in the ground beforehand. This confession was the smoking gun, the direct link they needed. However, it came with a tragic complication. Before the father could be compelled to testify against his own son in court, he passed away from an illness. His knowledge of the confession died with him, rendering it inadmissible hearsay in a courtroom. Despite this setback, prosecutors felt the weight of the circumstantial evidence was strong enough to move forward. They believed they could prove their case even without Jack's body. In April of 2012, nearly a year after Jack was killed, the Cape Girardeau County prosecuting attorney convened a grand jury. After hearing the evidence, the blood in the house, the documented threats, the suspicious behavior, and the timeline of events, the grand jury handed down an indictment. James Clay Waller was officially charged with first-degree murder and 2 counts of tampering with evidence. The state of Missouri was taking the rare and difficult step of prosecuting a murder case without the body of the victim. For Jack's family, it was a crucial step toward justice, but it was also the beginning of a long and uncertain legal battle. The man who killed her was now facing life in prison, but the most important question remained unanswered. Where was Jack? With Clay Waller formally charged with first-degree murder in April of 2012, the case entered a strange and agonizing period of limbo. On one hand, the man everyone believed to be responsible was behind bars, awaiting trial. On the other, the family of Jack Waller was still without the one thing they yearned for most, bringing her home. The indictment, while a victory for the prosecution, did not change the fact that Jack was still missing. Her parents, Stan and Ruby Rawson, and her sister, Cheryl Brenneck, lived with a constant, gnawing uncertainty. They organized and participated in numerous volunteer searches, driven by a desperate need for closure. Community members, moved by the family's plight, joined them, spending countless, scouring the rugged landscapes along the Mississippi River. But the area was vast, and the killer had chosen his hiding spot well. The searches, though valiant, were fruitless. For the prosecutors, the path ahead was a difficult one. No body murder trial is one of the most significant challenges in the legal system. They had a strong circumstantial case, the blood evidence, the history of threats, the missing carpet, the suspicious behavior, but without the victim's body, the defense could always plant the seed of doubt in the minds of. They could argue that Jack had simply run away to escape her life, that the blood was from a simple accident, that the entire case was a misinterpretation of events. The risk of an acquittal, while small, was still present. If Waller were to be found not guilty, he could never be tried for the murder again, even if Jack's body was found later. The stakes were incredibly high. As the months ticked by and the trial date approached, the pressure mounted on both sides. Clay Waller sat in jail, facing a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole if convicted of first-degree murder. His legal options were dwindling. The evidence against him was substantial, and the prosecution was clearly determined to see the case through. Faced with this grim reality, his defense attorneys approached the prosecutors with an offer. It was a bargain, a last-ditch effort for their client to avoid spending the rest of his natural life in a cell. The terms were stark. Clay Waller would agree to lead investigators to Jack's body. He would give her family the closure they so desperately needed. In return, the prosecution would have to reduce the charge from first-degree murder to second-degree murder, and Waller would plead guilty and accept the sentence of 20 years. The offer created an impossible dilemma for the prosecution and, most importantly, for Jack's family. The prosecutors, by law and by ethics, would not accept such a deal without the consent of the victim's loved ones. They presented the terms to the Rawson family. It was a horrific choice to force upon a grieving family. 20 years for the pre-planned, cold-blooded murder of their daughter felt like a travesty of justice. It was an insult to her memory. They believed, with every fiber of their being, that he deserved to be locked away forever. He had not only stolen Jack's life and future, but had also robbed his own children of their mother. 20-year sentence meant he could one day be a free man. But on the other side of that impossible choice was the answer to the question that had tormented them for 2 years. Where was Jack? The thought of her being lost forever, buried in some unknown, desolate place, was a unique and ongoing form of torture. This deal was likely their only chance to find her. It was the only way to give her a proper burial, a place where they could visit, and more. More than anything, it was about the triplets. They were growing up without a mother, and one day they would have more questions. The family felt they owed it to the children to provide a final resting place for their mother, a tangible end to the uncertainty. After agonizing deliberation, with unimaginably heavy hearts, Jack's family made their decision. They told the prosecutors to accept the deal. Finding Jack was more important than the length of her killer's prison sentence. On May 29, 2013, the deal was put into motion. Clay Waller, now a confessed killer, was escorted from his jail cell. In shackles, he led a somber procession of FBI agents and law enforcement officers. They traveled to the banks of the Mississippi River and boarded boats. The small fleet of vessels cut through the water, heading for the Illinois side. Waller, his face pale and gaunt, directed them to the secluded place known as Devil's Island. It was the same journey he had made 2 years earlier, first with a shovel and then with the body of his murdered wife. Once they arrived on the remote shore, he walked a short distance into the wilderness and pointed to a spot on the sandy ground. An excavation team immediately began to dig. The air was thick with a tense, somber anticipation. They carefully removed layers of sand and earth, and then they found her. Buried deep beneath the surface were the human remains of Jack Waller. It was an almost 2-year-long search, brought to an end by the man who had started it all. The discovery was heartbreaking, but it was also a profound relief. The long nightmare of not knowing was finally over. The on-site forensic team confirmed the identity. Jack had been found. With this discovery, Waller's confession was now an undeniable fact, corroborated by the presence of his victim's body exactly where he said it would be. The legal process moved to its conclusion. On June 6, 2013, Clay Waller appeared in a Missouri courtroom to formalize his plea. He officially pleaded guilty to the charge of second-degree murder. During the sentencing hearing, Jack's sister, Cheryl Brenneck, stood before the court to give a victim impact statement. Her voice filled with rage and sorrow, she stared directly at the man who had destroyed her family. She spoke of her sister's love for her children, of the bright future he had stolen from her, and of the profound, unending pain his actions had caused. She expressed her utter contempt for him, a man she described as a manipulative, narcissistic monster. Through it all, Clay Waller showed almost no emotion. He shuffled his feet and stared blankly ahead, a hollowed-out figure who seemed unmoved by the devastation he had created. Even a heartbreaking recording of his own son, saying he never wanted to see his father again, failed to elicit any visible reaction. The judge, bound by the terms of the plea agreement, sentenced Clay Waller to 20 years in state prison. For the family and the community, the sentence felt profoundly unjust. 20 years was not enough. The legal case in the state of Missouri, however, was now closed. It seemed as though the story had reached its final, unsatisfying chapter, but some prosecutors, operating in a different jurisdiction, felt the same way. Federal prosecutors had been monitoring the case from a distance. They, too, were deeply unsatisfied with the 20-year sentence, believing it did not reflect the depravity of Waller's premeditated crime. They began to explore other legal avenues, searching for a way to bring a more significant measure of justice. They found it in a federal statute that was not often used, the law against interstate domestic violence. Their legal theory was both creative and powerful. The crime had crossed state lines. Clay Waller had lured Jack to his home in Missouri, where he murdered her. He then transported her body across the Mississippi River to the state of Illinois, where he buried her on Devil's Island. According to federal law, traveling across state lines to commit an act of domestic violence that results in a death is a separate, federal crime. The state of Missouri had prosecuted him for the act of murder. The United States government could prosecute him for the act of crossing state lines in the commission of that murder. The plea deal he had made with the state of Missouri offered him no protection from the federal government. In September 2016, this new legal strategy came to fruition. A federal grand jury was convened, and they handed up an indictment against Clay Waller on one count of interstate domestic violence resulting in death. It was a stunning development. Just when it seemed like the legal saga was over, Waller was now facing a second trial, this time in a federal court. He was about to face a new team of prosecutors, a new jury, and the possibility of a much, much longer sentence. The fight for justice for Jack Waller was not over yet. Du CRI de la Piation 3, Piation Kui Kung Sia Kau Chai N, BTD UKCHB, and the federal trial of Clay Waller in September of 2016 was a second, and perhaps final, chance at true justice for Jack Waller. The atmosphere in the federal courtroom was tense. This was not a retrial of the murder itself. Waller's guilty plea in state court had already established him as the killer. The task for the federal prosecutors was more specific. They had to prove to a new jury that he had committed the crime of interstate domestic violence. They had to prove that his crime crossed the border from Missouri into Illinois. The prosecution methodically laid out their case, painting a portrait of a narcissistic and controlling man who had planned his wife's murder with chilling precision. They presented the jury with Jack's own words, reading excerpts from the journal where she had documented his terrifying threats. They presented the physical evidence from his home, the photos of the cut-out, blood-stained carpet. They recounted the story of how Waller had gone to Devil's Island the day before the murder to dig his wife's grave, an act that spoke volumes about his cold-blooded premeditation. The prosecutors argued that the entire murderous scheme was a single, continuous act that began in Missouri with the lure and the murder, and culminated in Illinois with the burial. The defense attorney's strategy was narrow and technical. They could not argue that their client was innocent of the killing. Instead, they focused on the word interstate. They argued that the federal government had failed to prove the specific element of the charge, that Jack was still alive when her husband transported her across the Mississippi River. If he had killed her in his Missouri home and then, later, transported her deceased body into Illinois, their argument was that it was the transportation of a body, not an act of ongoing domestic violence against a living person crossing state line. It was a fine legal point, and it was the only defense they had. But the prosecution had one more piece of evidence, something that transcended legal arguments and struck at the emotional heart of the case. They played for the jury a short, painful audio recording. It was the voice of Clay Waller's own son, who was just 5 years old at the time his mother was killed. In the recording, the little boy was being interviewed by a forensic specialist. His small voice, clear and innocent, filled the silent courtroom. He told the interviewer that he did not love his dad anymore. He said he never, ever wanted to see his father again. The sound of a child effectively disowning his father because of his monstrous act was more powerful than any legal argument. It was a stark reminder of the true cost of Waller's crime, the complete and utter devastation of his own family. The jury listened to all the evidence and the closing argument. They then retired to deliberate. They were not gone for long. Less than 2 hours later, they returned to the courtroom. The verdict was in. The foreman stood and, in a clear voice, declared Clay Waller guilty of the charge of interstate domestic violence resulting in a death. A wave of relief washed over Jack's family. The legal loophole had been closed. The second battle had been won. In January of 2017, Clay Waller appeared for his final sentencing. The federal judge, after reviewing the facts of the case, delivered a sentence that brought a true sense of finality. He sentenced Clay Waller to an additional 35 years in federal prison. This new, lengthy sentence would be served concurrently with his 20-year state sentence. But the federal system has much stricter rules, with virtually no possibility of early parole. The 35-year term was, for a man of his age, a life sentence. Justice, which had seemed so inadequate in the state's plea deal, had finally been delivered. Clay Waller would almost certainly die behind bars. Case 4. The evening of Saturday, January 6, 2007, was cold in Knoxville, Tennessee, but for Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom, it was just another night. At 21 years old, Shannon was a sociology major at the University of Tennessee. She had moved from Louisiana for her education, a bright and outgoing young woman with long, straight blonde hair and blue eyes. Her family and friends knew her as ambitious and intelligent, someone who filled a room with her presence. She balanced her studies with a part-time job at a local salon. Her boyfriend, Christopher, was 23. A former standout high school baseball player, he now worked as a carpenter, known for his steady hands and a kind, diligent nature. He was tall and athletic, a devoted partner to Shannon and close with his own family. They were a young couple with their futures laid out before them, navigating the early stages of a serious relationship. That night, they had gone to a friend's party at the Washington Ridge Apartments, a sprawling complex in North Knoxville. It was a casual get-together, the kind of unremarkable social event that happens every weekend in a university town. Shortly after 10:30 that evening, the couple decided to leave. They said their goodbyes and walked out into the cool night air, heading toward the parking lot where Shannon's gray 2005 Toyota 4Runner was parked. It was a short walk, a mundane end to a pleasant evening. As they reached the vehicle, their world was violently upended. At least 2 men emerged from the shadows of the parking lot. They were armed. Before Shannon or Christopher could react, they were confronted, threatened with a handgun, and overpowered. The objective was the vehicle, but the crime didn't end with a simple car theft. The assailants forced the young couple into the 4Runner. Under the threat of death, Shannon and Christopher were abducted, driven away from the safety of the apartment complex and into the darkness, their destination a terrifying unknown. They were taken to a small, single-story house at 2316 Chipman Street in a low-income neighborhood in East Knoxville. The house was a rental, its interior cluttered and dirty, the kind of place that felt temporary and uncared for. This was the residence of a man named Lemercus Davidson, and it would become the scene of unspeakable horrors. Once inside, Shannon and Christopher were immediately separated. Any hope they had of protecting each other was extinguished. Christopher was taken to a bedroom, where he was bound, blindfolded, and gagged. Shannon was taken to another part of the small house, her fate now entirely in the hands of her captor. Throughout the night and into the early hours of Sunday, January 7th, Christopher Newsom endured a brutal ordeal. He was tortured and sexually assaulted by several of his captors. Later forensic examination would reveal the extent of the abuse, including evidence that he had been sodomized with a foreign object. As the sun began to rise, his captors made a decision. They led him from the house. His hands were bound behind his back, his eyes and mouth still covered. Barefoot, he was forced to walk to a desolate area nearby, a set of Norfolk Southern Railroad tracks at the end of Chipman Street. There, his life was ended. He was shot 3 times with a small, .22 caliber pistol. One bullet entered the back of his neck, another struck his back, and a third hit his shoulder. After he fell, his attackers poured gasoline over his body and set it on fire. They left his charred remains beside the tracks and returned to the house on Chipman Street. Back inside the house, Shannon Christian's nightmare was far from over. She was now the sole focus of the group's depravity. For what investigators believe was a period of more than 24 hours, she was held captive. She suffered continuous physical torture and was repeatedly and collectively raped by at least 3 men: Lemercus Davidson, his half-brother Elvis Cobbins, and their friend, George Thomas. As the hours wore on, the perpetrators began to think about covering their track. In a calculated act of cruelty designed to destroy evidence, they forced Shannon to drink bleach, hoping to eliminate any of their DNA from her mouth. They used the same harsh cleaning chemical to wipe down her body in areas of the house, attempting to erase the evidence of their crimes. Finally, after enduring hours of unimaginable torment, Shannon was silenced. Her attackers bound her hands and feet tightly with strips torn from a bedsheet. A small towel was shoved into her mouth to stifle any sound. Then, they took her limp body and forced it into a large trash bag. They placed that bag inside another, and another, until she was sealed within 5 layers of black plastic. The tightly bound bundle was then lifted and placed inside a large residential trash can in the kitchen. The medical examiner would later determine that Shannon Christian did not die instantly. She suffocated, slowly, inside that dark, confined space. By Monday morning, January 8th, the families of Shannon and Christopher were frantic. Calls to their cell phones went straight to voicemail. They hadn't come home. They hadn't shown up for work or class. This was completely out of character for both of them. Their parents contacted the authorities, and missing persons reports were officially filed. The search began later that afternoon. The first terrible discovery was made. A railroad worker, going about his daily duties, spotted something unusual near the tracks at the end of Chipman Street. It was the badly burned body of a man. The Knoxville Police Department was dispatched to the scene, which was immediately secured. It was now a homicide investigation. The following day, Tuesday, January 9th, the coroner's office confirmed the victim's identity through dental records. It was Christopher Newsom. The news devastated his family and confirmed the worst fears of the Christian family. Their daughter was still missing, and her boyfriend had been murdered. The investigation now had a grim urgency. Police resources were focused on finding Shannon, hoping against hope that she might still be alive. A critical break in the case came that afternoon. Investigators located Shannon's missing Toyota 4Runner. It was parked on the side of Chipman Street, not far from where Christopher's body had been found. The discovery immediately narrowed the geographic focus of the investigation to this small, troubled neighborhood. The vehicle was carefully towed to a secure facility for a thorough forensic examination. As crime scene technicians began their painstaking work on the SUV, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. At approximately 5:30 in the evening, a call came into the police department. A local resident reported that the tenant of the house at 2316 Chipman Street seemed to have left in a hurry, leaving the front door open. Given the proximity to both the body recovery site and the location of the abandoned vehicle, police responded immediately. Officers arrived at the small, unassuming house. It was quiet. They announced their presence and, receiving no answer, entered to conduct a welfare check. The air inside was stale and thick with the overwhelming, acrid smell of bleach. The house was in disarray, a clear sign of a hasty departure. The officers moved cautiously from room to room. In the kitchen, they noticed a large, upright trash can. One of the officers, acting on a gut feeling, lifted the lid. He saw the top of a black plastic trash bag. As he and his partner began to pull it out, they realized it was unusually heavy. They pulled the first bag out, only to find another sealed bag inside it. They opened the second and found a third. After removing 4 layers, they reached the 5th and final bag. Carefully, they cut it open. Inside, they found the bound and brutalized body of Shannon Christian. The search was over. A missing persons case had escalated into a double homicide investigation of almost unimaginable. The focus now shifted from finding the victims to hunting down the monsters responsible. With the discovery of the victims, the house at 2316 Chipman Street was sealed, becoming the third and most critical crime scene in the investigation. The Knoxville Police Department, aided by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, was now faced with the monumental task of deconstructing a crime of breathtaking brutality. They had 3 distinct locations to process: the railroad tracks where the first victim was found, the victim's abandoned SUV, and the house that had served as a torture chamber. Each location held pieces of the puzzle, and it was the meticulous work of forensic investigators that would turn random clues into a clear picture of the perpetrator. At the first crime scene, the section of railroad tracks at the end of the street, investigators worked the ground where Christopher Newsom's body had been set ablaze. They recovered spent shell casings, confirming he had been shot. The caliber was small, .22, suggesting the weapon was a pistol, not a rifle or shotgun. Soil samples were taken, which later tested positive for gasoline, the accelerant used to start the fire. Fragments of the fabric used to bind his hands and feet were also carefully collected. While the fire had destroyed much, it had not erased the fundamental facts of a cold-blooded execution. The second crime scene, Shannon Christian's Toyota 4Runner, proved to be the source of the investigation's first major breakthrough. The vehicle, found just a short distance from the house, was a treasure trove of potential evidence. Crime scene technicians descended upon it, dusting every surface for fingerprints, vacuuming the carpets for trace evidence, and swabbing for any biological material. Inside the vehicle, they found an envelope. It was a seemingly insignificant piece of paper, but it would change the entire course of the investigation. On its surface, technicians were able to lift a clean, clear latent fingerprint. Simultaneously, they noted the documents inside the envelope belonged to a man named Lemercus Deval Davidson. The name meant nothing to them yet, but the fingerprint was a tangible link between an unknown individual and the victim's vehicle. The third and most horrific crime scene was the house itself. The strong, chemical odor of bleach was the first thing investigators noted, a clear indication that the killers had attempted a thorough cleanup. But rage and panic often leave traces that bleach cannot erase. Inside, the scene was chaotic. The forensic team began a methodical sweep. In the bedroom where Christopher Newsom was likely held, they found more strips of torn bedsheets matching those used to bind him. Throughout the house, they collected items that would later be tested for DNA. The most crucial evidence, however, came from the body of Shannon Christian. The autopsy was a grim but necessary process. The medical examiner was able to collect samples of seminal fluid from the victim's body. In a world of forensic science, this was the suspect's genetic signature, an undeniable link to the assault. On one of the 5 trash bags that had been used to suffocate her, investigators found another critical piece of evidence, another fingerprint. While the forensic teams worked, the fingerprint lifted from the envelope in the 4Runner was fast-tracked. It was entered into the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, or AFIS, a national database containing the prints of millions of individuals with criminal records. The system searched for a match. The wait was not long. A hit came back, identifying the print as belonging to 25-year-old Lemercus Deval Davidson. He had a substantial criminal record, including a prior carjacking in 2005 for which he was currently out on bond. Suddenly, the investigation had a primary suspect. Detectives immediately ran his name through their local databases, and the pieces began to snap into place with breathtaking speed. The records showed that the house at 2316 Chipman Street, the very house where Shannon's body was found, was being rented by Lemercus Davidson. The connection was now concrete and irrefutable. The man whose fingerprint was in the victim's car was also the tenant of the house where the murders occurred. Investigators now knew who they were looking for. From Davidson, the web of accomplices quickly unraveled. Police dug into his known associates, his family, and his recent activities. They learned that his half-brother, 24-year-old Elvis Darnell Cobbins, and Cobbins' 18-year-old girlfriend, Vanessa Lynn Coleman, had recently come to Knoxville from Kentucky to stay with him. Another friend, 24-year-old George Giovanni Thomas, was also part of Davidson's immediate circle and had been at the house. The DNA analysis began to yield results that corroborated this. Semen samples recovered from Channon Christian's body were a match to Lemarcus Davidson and Elvis Cobbins, and the fingerprint found on the trash bag used to entomb her was matched to Vanessa Coleman. The investigation now had 4 primary targets: Davidson, Cobbins, Thomas, and Coleman. With their identities confirmed, a massive, multi-state manhunt was launched. The suspects, realizing the police had found the bodies, had scattered. Davidson, the ringleader, went to ground locally. The others fled the state. On January 11, just 2 days after Channon's body was discovered, the first arrests were made. Acting on a tip, law enforcement in Lebanon, Kentucky, located and arrested Elvis Cobbins and Vanessa Coleman without incident. They had fled back to their home state, but there was nowhere to hide. Later that same day, the focus of the manhunt zeroed in on the primary suspect. Investigators tracked Lemarcus Davidson to an empty, abandoned house not far from Chipman Street in Knoxville. A SWAT team surrounded the location. After a tense standoff, Davidson was flushed out and taken into custody. The man who had orchestrated the entire horrific event was now in handcuffs. The following day, January 12th, the final principal suspect was apprehended. George Thomas, perhaps realizing the futility of running, surrendered to police back in Lebanon, Kentucky. In less than a week after the discovery of the first victim, a team of determined investigators had pieced together the evidence from 3 crime scenes, identified 4 suspects through forensic science and police work, and hunted them down. A 5th man, Eric Dwayne Boyd, was also identified as an associate who had helped Davidson hide after the crimes, an accessory after the fact. With the alleged perpetrators behind bars, the city of Knoxville breathed a collective sigh of relief. The immediate terror was over, but for the families of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom, the next phase of their nightmare was just beginning, the long and arduous journey for justice through the court system. With the 4 main perpetrators in custody, the investigation transitioned into a prosecution. The city of Knoxville, and indeed the nation, began to learn more about the individuals responsible for the deaths of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. They were not criminal masterminds, but a small, interconnected group whose lives were characterized by instability and prior contact with the law. The ringleader was 25-year-old Lemarcus "Slim" Davidson. He had an extensive criminal history and, in a tragic failure of the justice system, was out on probation for a 2005 armed carjacking at the time of the murder. The house on Chipman Street was his domain, and by all accounts, he was the primary aggressor and decision-maker throughout the ordeal. His 24-year-old half-brother, Elvis Rome Cobbins, also had a criminal record in his home state of Kentucky. The evidence, particularly the DNA, placed him as a central and active participant in the torture and assaults against both victims. Their friend, George G. Thomas, also 24, was more of an enigma. While no direct DNA evidence linked him to the sexual assaults, his presence throughout the entire crime spree, acting as a lookout and doing nothing to stop the atrocities or help the victims, made him fully culpable under the legal principle of felony murder. The 4th individual was 18-year-old Vanessa Coleman, the girlfriend of Elvis Cobbins. She was the youngest and the only one without a prior record. She would later claim she was a victim herself, coerced and terrified into silence. But her fingerprint on a trash bag used to suffocate Channon Christian told a different story, one of at least passive participation in facilitating the crime. The legal process began, but it was destined to be a long and tortuous path, complicated by the fact that there were 4 defendants, each requiring separate trials. In 2009, the trials began. Lemarcus Davidson was found guilty on 36 counts, including first-degree murder, felony murder, robbery, kidnapping, and rape. The jury sentenced him to death. Later that year, Elvis Cobbins and George Thomas were also tried. Both were convicted of murder and numerous other charges, and both were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 2010, Vanessa Coleman faced her trial. She was acquitted of the most serious charges of first-degree murder, but was found guilty of facilitating the felony murders and other crimes. She received a sentence of 53 years. For the grieving families, It seemed that justice, though agonizingly slow, had finally been served. But their ordeal was far from over. In a shocking twist that had nothing to do with the evidence of the case, the entire legal foundation of the verdicts crumbled. The presiding judge for all 4 trials, Judge Richard Baumgartner, became the subject of a state investigation. The investigation revealed that the judge was struggling with a severe prescription drug addiction and had been illegally purchasing pills from a felon whose cases were being heard in his own court. The scandal was a bombshell that destroyed the judge's career and cast a dark shadow over the local judiciary. For the Christian and Nuzum families, the consequences were devastating. Because of the judge's misconduct, his legal judgment in every case he oversaw during that period was deemed compromised. All 4 hard-won convictions and sentences were set aside. The process would have to start all over again. What followed was a years-long legal battle as prosecutors worked to rebuild the cases against the 4 defendants. In 2012, Lemercus Davidson, whose conviction was allowed to stand, faced a new sentencing hearing. A new jury listened to the horrific evidence once more and came to the same conclusion as the first. The death sentence was reaffirmed. Today, he remains on death row in Tennessee. Elvis Cobbins was granted an entirely new trial. In 2018, nearly a decade after his first conviction, he was once again found guilty by a jury and once again sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The legal path for George Thomas was even more convoluted. He was granted a new trial in 2013 and was, for a second time, convicted and sentenced to life. However, that second conviction was appealed and overturned again on an unrelated legal technicality involving jury selection. Facing the prospect of a third trial in 2015, Thomas accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to a range of charges, including facilitation of felony murder, and received a sentence of 50 years in prison. Vanessa Coleman was also retried in 2012. This time, she was convicted of lesser charges and received a reduced sentence of 35 years. There was still one loose end. The 5th man, Eric E. Boyd. Initially, he had only been convicted at the state level in 2008 for being an accessory after the fact, for helping Lemercus Davidson hide from the police. His 18-year sentence was seen by many as a miscarriage of justice for his connection to the case. But the families and prosecutors never gave up. Years later, federal authorities built a new case against Boyd, arguing that while he may not have been in the house during the murders, he had been a key player in the initial carjacking. Under federal law, participating in a carjacking that results in a death makes you responsible for that death. In 2019, more than 12 years after the crime, Eric Boyd was convicted in federal court for his role. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, ensuring the final participant in the crime would die in prison. The murders of Channon Christian and Christopher Nuzum left a deep scar on the community of Knoxville and sent shockwaves across the country. The case's brutality prompted the Tennessee legislature to pass the Channon Christian Act in 2008, a law that eliminates early release credits for the most violent offenders, forcing them to serve 100% of their sentences. The case also ignited a fierce national debate. Because the victims were white and the perpetrators were black, some commentators and bloggers labeled the crime a racially motivated hate crime. However, investigators never found sufficient evidence to support this, concluding that the primary motive was robbery and carjacking, which then escalated into something far more monstrous. In the end, while the legal system provided its answers, the fundamental question of the case remains. The motive for the initial carjacking is clear, but it fails to explain the sustained, sadistic cruelty inflicted upon 2 innocent people over the course of many hours. The answer seems to lie not in motive, but in a complete and terrifying absence of humanity. It was a perfect storm of remorseless individuals, led by a violent felon who should have already been in prison, converging on a single night to commit an act of unimaginable. The case of Channon Christian and Christopher Nuzum stands as a chilling reminder of the dark potential of the human soul, and a testament to the enduring love of 2 families who fought for more than a decade to ensure that justice, however delayed, was ultimately done. Case 5. The morning of September 11, 2001, broke over Chicago with an unnerving stillness. The air was crisp, tearing the first hints of autumn. For the wife of the victim, it was a morning like any other. Her routine was etched in discipline, an early run through the manicured streets of her wealthy, quiet neighborhood. As she ran, the world was still whole. But by the time she returned, pulling earbuds from her ears, the first cracks in that world were already beginning to show. A television flickered through a neighbor's window, showing confusing, chaotic images from New York City. A plane, a tower, smoke against a clear blue sky. It was a distant tragedy, horrifying but abstract, something happening far away. Her own personal horror was waiting just inside her front door. She entered the luxurious townhome, a symbol of the success her husband had built. The house was silent, not the peaceful silence of an empty home, but a heavy, unnatural quiet. The children, Alex and Sophie, were with their grandparents for the week. Her husband, the victim, should have been getting ready for work. She called his name. The silence answered back. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach as she walked up the grand staircase toward the master bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. When she pushed it open, the scene that greeted her would forever sever her life into a before and an after. Her husband was on the floor, lying motionless beside their bed. He was dressed in a suit, as if he had been ready to leave and conquer the world one more time. But a dark stain was spreading across the crisp white of his shirt, originating from a single, devastating wound in his chest. His eyes were open, fixed on a world he could no longer see. The distant, televised chaos of a national tragedy suddenly converged into this single, intimate point of absolute devastation. The first officers to arrive found the victim's wife in a state of shock, but with a strange, unnerving composure. The patrolmen secured the scene, their movements careful, their voices low. The date, September 11, was already branding itself into the mind of every American, and the responding officers felt the weight of a world tilting on its axis. Within this national crisis, they now had to contend with a brutal, personal. Detective James O'Connor was assigned as the lead investigator. He was a seasoned detective in his 40s, a man who had seen the worst of Chicago and had learned to trust his instincts above all else. As he stepped into the pristine crime scene, his instincts told him something was fundamentally wrong. The initial assessment suggested a robbery gone bad. A wallet was tossed on the floor, a drawer pulled open. But it felt performative, staged. There were no signs of forced entry into the multi-million-dollar home. The victim was killed with a single, precise gunshot to the chest, an execution, not the frantic violence of a panicked burglar. It was too clean, too deliberate. Detective O'Connor walked through the silent house, feeling the deep chill of a murder that was not random, but deeply personal. His attention turned to the victim's wife, Claire Dunn. In her interview, she was articulate, her grief palpable yet controlled. She recounted her morning routine, the discovery, the call to 911. She painted a picture of a perfect life, a loving husband, a successful man. But then, she said something that snagged in the detective's mind. "We had everything," she said, her voice trailing off for just a moment. "Or I thought we did." It was a flicker of doubt, a hint of darkness beneath the polished surface. That single phrase was the first loose thread, and Detective O'Connor knew he had to pull on it. He decided the key to this murder wasn't in the staged chaos of the bedroom, but in the complex, hidden life of the victim himself. Michael Dunn was, by all public accounts, a titan of the Chicago real estate world. He was the charismatic face of a sprawling empire he had built from the ground up. He was a philanthropist, a family man, a symbol of But as Detective O'Connor and his team began digging into his professional life, a second, much darker portrait of the man began to emerge. In the cutthroat world of high-stakes real estate, the victim wasn't just successful, he was ruthless. He was known for a take-no-prisoners approach, a man who would do whatever it took to close a deal, regardless of who was left in his wake. This reputation meant that the list of potential enemies was long. The first name on that list was Robert Sloan, the business partner. He and the victim had been friends since college, the two architects of the real estate firm. Sloan was the quiet, methodical analyst to the victim's flamboyant salesmanship. They were a perfect team until they weren't. Interviews with company employees revealed that the relationship had dramatically in the months leading up to the murder. The source of the conflict was a massive, multi-million-dollar skyscraper deal. The victim saw it as a legacy-defining project, a high-risk gamble with a monumental payoff. The partner, however, saw it as a reckless bet that could bankrupt the company. He argued for safer, more conservative investments. The disagreement wasn't just professional, it became intensely personal. Staffers reported seeing the two men engaged in furious, shouting arguments behind closed doors. One junior executive told investigators he overheard the partner threaten the victim, yelling that he would ruin him if he went through with the deal. The motive seemed clear, a business dispute that had spiraled into violent rage. The investigators dug deeper and uncovered a more profound betrayal. They found evidence that the victim was secretly maneuvering to buy out his partner's shares in the company. He was planning to force out the very man who had helped him build his empire, casting him aside just before the biggest deal of their careers. When the partner found out about this, his anger would have been explosive. He had the motive, the rage, and years of simmering resentment. Robert Sloan immediately became the primary suspect in the murder of his partner. But just as the case against the partner seemed to be solidifying, the investigation uncovered another layer to the victim's secret life. While examining his financial records, detectives stumbled upon a series of suspicious transactions. They traced them to the recent acquisition of a large commercial building. The seller was not a legitimate company. It was a front for a notorious organized crime syndicate that was already the subject of a federal investigation. This discovery threw a new, dangerous variable into the mix. The victim hadn't just been ruthless. He had been reckless, stepping into a world of violent criminals. His death could have been the result of a deal with the mob gone wrong. Was he an accomplice in a money laundering scheme? Did he know too much? Was his murder a professional hit, ordered by people who solved their problems with a single, clean shot? Detective O'Connor now faced two powerful. Was this a crime of passion and betrayal, committed by a business partner pushed to the edge? Or was it a cold-blooded execution by organized crime, a consequence of the victim's own greed? The answer was hidden somewhere in the secrets the victim left behind, and O'Connor knew the investigation had only just begun to scratch the surface. With two viable but vastly different theories on the table, Detective O'Connor's team split its focus. One group of investigators descended into the shadowy world of organized crime. They liaised with the FBI, pulling files on the syndicate the victim had been dealing with. They scrutinized every detail of the building transaction, looking for irregularities, for pressure points, for anything that smelled of extortion or a deal gone. They tried to cultivate informants, hoping to hear whispers on the street of a high-profile hit. But the criminal underworld was a closed book. The syndicate was disciplined, and its members were silent. The trail was cold, a frustrating dead end paved with whispers and innuendo but no hard facts. The possibility of a mob hit remained a persistent shadow in the background, but it was a shadow they could not grasp. The other half of the investigation focused squarely on the man with the most obvious motive, the business partner, Robert Sloan. Investigators brought him in for a formal. He walked into the interrogation room, radiating an aura of bitter resentment. He did not perform grief. His anger was too raw for that. He spoke of his former friend with a mix of historical respect and present-day contempt, describing the victim as a brilliant but reckless egomaniac who had lost his way. He readily admitted to the fierce arguments over the skyscraper deal, painting them as his desperate attempts to save the company from his partner. Did I hate what he was doing to our company? Yes, the partner stated, his voice tight with anger. Did I want him dead? No. He was a fool, not a monster. He had an alibi for the time of the murder. He claimed he was at home, alone, working. It was convenient and impossible to verify. While he denied everything, his palpable rage and clear motive made him the perfect suspect. He left the interview with the cloud of suspicion hanging even more heavily over his head. Search warrants were executed for the partner's home and office. Detectives meticulously combed through his life, looking for the murder weapon, for blood-stained clothes, for anything that could tie him to the scene. They found nothing. What they did find were emails, memos, and legal documents that painted a clear picture of his escalating conflict with the victim. The evidence documented a relationship in its death throes, but it didn't place a gun in hand. Weeks turned into a month. The investigation was grinding to a halt. They had a prime suspect with a powerful motive, but no physical evidence to make an arrest. The organized crime angle was a ghost. Detective O'Connor felt the case slipping through his fingers, the trail growing colder with each passing day. And then, the phone rang. It was an anonymous call, the kind that can make or break a case. The voice on the other end was hesitant, a man afraid of getting involved. He told the detective he worked in an office building across the street from the victim's company. A few days before the murder, he had been working late and saw something through the victim's large office window. He witnessed the victim in a furious, explosive argument with a woman. The caller said it was clearly not a business disagreement. It was personal, intense. He saw the woman slam her hands on the desk, her face contorted with rage. He heard her voice, even through the thick glass, raised in a scream about money and broken promises. The caller identified the woman. It was Emily Carter, a senior executive in the victim's firm. The name landed like a bomb in the middle of the investigation. Emily Carter was a name they knew, but only as a high-level employee. In initial background checks, she had been described as a model professional, intelligent, polished, and fiercely loyal to the victim. She was one of his most trusted deputies, instrumental in many of his biggest deals. There was absolutely nothing in their initial review to suggest any conflict. This anonymous tip didn't just provide a new lead, it ripped open an entirely new, hidden dimension of the case. Detective O'Connor had the executive brought in for questioning immediately. She walked into the interview room with an air of unshakable calm. She was impeccably dressed, her posture perfect, her expression a carefully constructed mask of polite concern. She was the polar opposite of the openly hostile Robert Sloan. She spoke of the victim in glowing terms, calling him a challenging but brilliant mentor who had given her incredible opportunities. She expressed profound shock and sadness at his brutal murder. When O'Connor asked her about an argument just days before his death, her composure didn't crack. She denied it flatly. An argument with Michael? No, of course not, she said, her tone smooth as glass. We had a wonderful working relationship. I respected him immensely. She denied any personal involvement, any financial dispute, anything that deviated from the script of a devoted employee mourning her boss. Her performance was flawless. But it was that very flawlessness that set off every alarm in Detective O'Connor's mind. It was too polished, too perfect. He had seen this kind of control before in the staged robbery at the crime scene. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that she was lying. Her calm was not the calm of innocence. It was the calm of profound deception. Leaving the interview, O'Connor ordered his team to dig into everything related to the executive. They were no longer just looking at a business partner's rage or a mob hit. They were now looking at a secret life, a hidden conflict, and a woman who was clearly hiding something crucial. The first thing they did was pull the phone records for both the prime suspect, Robert Sloan, and this new person of interest, Emily Carter. They were looking for any connection, any communication that might seem out of place. What they found blew the case wide open. In the week leading up to the murder, the communication logs between the business partner and the executive lit up. There had been dozens of calls and text messages between them, often late at night. This wasn't the communication of two colleagues discussing a project. This was the intense, urgent communication of co-conspirators. The two primary suspects, each with their own secret motives, were not separate entities orbiting the victim. They were connected, and suddenly, Detective O'Connor realized he wasn't investigating a single act of rage anymore. He was investigating a conspiracy. The discovery of the phone records was the key Detective O'Connor needed. The intense communication between the prime suspect and the polished executive was the thread that connected the two seemingly separate motives of rage and greed. He brought Emily Carter in for a second interrogation. This time, the atmosphere in the small, gray room was different. The detective's questions were no longer exploratory. They were pointed, sharp, and backed by undeniable. He let her retell her story one last time, the story of a professional relationship, of respect and admiration. He let her build the walls of her lies high, just so he could enjoy the satisfaction of knocking them down. Then, he slid a thick stack of paper across the table. It was the log of every call, every text message between her and Robert Sloan in the week before the murder. He said nothing, simply letting her look at the damning timeline of her own conspiracy. Her composure, so perfect and impenetrable before, began to fracture. A slight tremor in her hand, a flicker in her eyes. The mask of the calm professional dissolved, revealing the desperate, cornered woman beneath. Detective O'Connor leaned forward. The business partner, Sloan, is drowning, he said, his voice low and even. Right now, his lawyers are probably telling him to give you up to save himself. This is your only chance to tell your side of the story. And with that, the dam broke. A sob escaped her lips, and the entire, sordid story poured out in a torrent of confessions, a narrative of greed, betrayal, and cold-blooded murder. She admitted what the investigators had begun to suspect. She and the victim were not just colleagues. They had been romantically involved for over a year. Their relationship was a secret, hidden within the corporate structure he commanded. The failed skyscraper deal was at the heart of it all. It was meant to be their master. The victim had promised her a staggering bonus for her work on the deal, a sum of money that would guarantee her future. But when the deal collapsed under its own weight, the victim reneged on his promise. He told her there was no money, that she would get nothing. For the executive, it was a dual betrayal, financial and deeply personal. The man she had admired, worked for, and loved had cast her aside the moment she was no longer profitable. Consumed by a sense of betrayal and frustrated greed, her anger simmered. It was during this time that the business partner, Robert Sloan, approached her. He had somehow found out about her dispute with the victim. Seeing in her a fellow traveler, another person betrayed by the same man, he saw an opportunity. It was the partner, she confessed, who first gave voice to the idea of murder. He was a man pushed to the brink, furious at the prospect of being forced out of the company he had co-founded. He channeled his rage into a cold, calculated proposal. If the victim were gone, all their problems would be solved. The partner would gain undisputed control of the real estate empire. The executive would get the money she was promised, and much more. Her shared victim had made the fatal mistake of betraying the two people who knew his business and his life most intimately. With her confession, the investigators could finally piece together a complete and chilling reconstruction of the crime. The plan was meticulously crafted during their late-night calls. On the morning of September 11th, the executive used her intimate relationship as the ultimate weapon. She called the victim, telling him she needed to discuss an urgent matter related to the failed deal, using the pretense of work to lure him to his own home before heading to the office. The victim, suspecting nothing, agreed. He walked into his luxurious home and straight into an ambush. The business partner, Robert Sloan, was already inside, lying in wait. Sloan confronted the victim. Decades of friendship and partnership ended in a final, brutal confrontation. And then, the partner raised the gun he had brought with him and fired a single shot into his friend's chest. After the murder, the two conspirators moved quickly. They worked together in the silent house, tossing a wallet, pulling open a drawer, staging the scene to look like a random robbery gone wrong. It was a desperate, amateurish attempt to create confusion, to point the police in any direction but their own. Afterward, the executive slipped away, her face a mask of calm, just as a nation was beginning to grapple with a larger, unimaginable tragedy. Based on the executive's detailed confession, which implicated them both, Emily Carter and Robert Sloan were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The subsequent trial captivated the Chicago business world, laying bare the dark underbelly of ambition and success. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence. The phone records, the confession, and surveillance footage from a neighboring property that showed the executive's car leaving the area moments after the estimated time of death. Acting on information from the confession, investigators had also recovered the murder weapon from a river, a handgun registered to Robert Sloan. The defense attorneys tried to turn the conspirators against each other. The partners' legal team portrayed the executive as a manipulative femme fatale who had seduced and corrupted their client. Her team painted the partner as a violent, unstable man who had coerced her into the plot. But the jury saw through the theatrics. They saw two guilty individuals, bound by a shared pact of greed and revenge. The victim's wife, Claire Dunn, gave a heartbreaking testimony, describing her husband not as a saint, but as a complex and driven man whose ambition created a world of immense pressure and dangerous rivalries. The jury found both Robert Sloan and Emily Carter guilty of first-degree murder. They were both sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, their promising futures extinguished by a single, murderous act. The business empire the victim had spent his life building quickly crumbled in the wake of the scandal. His name, once a symbol of success, was now a permanent cautionary tale in Chicago, a story about the price of winning at all costs. In the end, Michael Dunn was the victim of a brutal murder, but he was not an entirely innocent one. His own ruthlessness in business and infidelity in his personal life created the toxic environment in which the conspiracy against him could grow. He had sown the seeds of resentment and betrayal, and on a quiet Tuesday morning, while the world looked east in horror, those seeds yielded their terrible harvest, brought forth by the two people he should have been able to trust the most, his partner and his lover. Case 6. The alert for the silver Dodge Grand Caravan spread rapidly through every law enforcement channel in West Michigan. Based on the detailed description provided by the teenage survivor, investigators began the systematic process of combing through vehicle registration records. The search quickly narrowed down to a 46-year-old factory worker who lived in nearby Muskegon Township. His name was Jeffrey Thomas Willis, and he was the registered owner of a silver minivan matching the one used in the abduction. On May 17, 2016, police located the suspect driving his vehicle and initiated a traffic stop. He was taken into custody without incident, initially on charges related to the kidnapping of the 16-year-old girl. With the suspect in custody, investigators immediately secured his van and obtained a warrant to search it. They knew he was dangerous, but they had no idea what they were about to uncover. What they found inside that minivan was not just evidence of a kidnapping. It was the meticulously organized toolkit of a serial predator. Tucked away in a hidden compartment, investigators discovered what could only be described as a murder kit. The contents were chillingly practical. There was a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol, fully loaded. Alongside it was extra ammunition. There were syringes, some filled with an unidentified liquid, likely the substance the teenagers saw him preparing. They found a ball gag, chains, and multiple sets of handcuffs. There was a mask, designed to conceal his identity or perhaps to terrorize his victims. One of the most disturbing items was a wooden bar with wrist restraints attached to both ends, a purpose-built tool for complete incapacitation. The kit also contained video recording equipment. It was a horrifying collection that spoke to a dark and calculated fantasy of capture, control, and assault. The suspect wasn't just planning these acts. He was equipped for them. Among the items, one, in particular, caught the immediate attention of the veteran detectives, the .22 caliber pistol. They remembered the shell casings recovered from the scene of Rebecca Blesh's murder 2 years prior. It was a long shot, but it was a connection they had to pursue. The pistol was carefully bagged as evidence and rushed to the Michigan State Police Crime Lab for ballistic analysis. At the lab, forensic scientists got to work. They test-fired the suspect's pistol into a water tank to recover a pristine, undamaged bullet. They then placed this test bullet and the shell casings from the 2014 crime scene under a comparison microscope. This specialized tool allows a scientist to see two items side by side, looking for microscopic striations, tiny scratches and grooves left on a bullet and casing as they are fired from a gun. These markings are as unique as a fingerprint. If the patterns match, it is definitive proof that both pieces of ammunition were fired from the same weapon. The call from the crime lab to the sheriff's office was the moment the entire investigation changed. The results were it was a perfect match. The microscopic markings on the shell casings found next to Rebecca Blesh's body in 2014 were identical to the markings from the gun found in Jeffrey Willis's van in 2016. After 2 years of dead ends and frustration, they had found the murder weapon. And more importantly, they now had the man it belonged to. This ballistic link provided the probable cause investigators needed to dramatically expand their search. They secured new warrants, this time for the suspect's home and his personal computers. The suspect was no longer just a kidnapper who happened to own a gun used in a past murder. He was now the prime suspect in that murder, and investigators believed he was hiding more secrets. The search of his home in Muskegon Township revealed a man living a disturbing double life. On the surface, he was a married man with a steady job. But inside the home, and particularly on his electronic devices, investigators began to uncover the depths of his depravity. The digital forensics team began to clone the hard drives from his computers, a process that creates an exact copy for them to analyze. As they sifted through terabytes of data, they made their most shocking discovery yet. Buried deep within the file structure of his main computer was a folder labeled simply VIX. It didn't take long for investigators to decipher the chilling shorthand. VIX stood for victims. Inside this folder, their horror grew. There were subfolders, each one appearing to be a digital trophy file for his crimes. One folder was titled with the initials, RSB. The detectives immediately knew who that was. Rebecca Sue Blech. Inside the RSB folder, the suspect had saved information related to her case, including the date she was killed. He was cataloging his victim. The discovery also opened up a new, terrifying possibility. There was another subfolder inside VIX, this one labeled JH, who was Jaish. Investigators raced to check their records for other open cases, specifically missing persons. The initials matched the case of Jessica Hiringa, a 25-year-old mother who had vanished from her late-night shift at a gas station in Norton Shores in April of 2013, a year before the Blech murder. Her disappearance had also remained a frustrating mystery with no solid leads. Now, it seemed they had found the man responsible for that as well. The suspect wasn't just a murderer. He was potentially a serial killer who had been operating undetected in their community for years. The rest of the data on his computer painted an even darker picture. It was filled with vast amounts of child pornography and graphic, violent videos depicting the torture and murder of women. They also found videos that the suspect had filmed himself, covertly recording unsuspecting women and girls at public places like parks and beaches. It was clear that he had been escalating his predatory behavior for a long time, moving from voyeurism to planning, and ultimately, to abduction and murder. Armed with an overwhelming amount of evidence, the survivor's testimony, the murder weapon, and the suspect's own digital records, the prosecution moved forward. On May 25, 2016, the Muskegon County prosecutor held a press conference. He formally announced that Jeffrey Thomas Willis, who was already in custody for the April kidnapping, was now being charged with the murder of Rebecca Bletch for her family and for the community. It was a stunning development. The random, senseless act of violence that had haunted them for 2 years finally had a face and a name. The legal process was just beginning, but the long, cold wait for a suspect was finally over. The trial of Jeffrey Thomas Willis for the first-degree murder of Rebecca Bletch began in the fall of 2017. The prosecution, led by Muskegon County Prosecutor D.J. Hilson, faced the challenge of proving a case that had no direct eyewitness. Their entire argument was built on a chain of powerful circumstantial evidence, and they methodically laid it out for the jury, piece by incriminating piece. A key witness was the 16-year-old survivor of the 2016 kidnapping. She took the stand and bravely recounted her terrifying ordeal. While she could not speak to the events of Rebecca Bletch's murder, her testimony was critical. It established the suspect's method of operation, his willingness to use a gun to abduct a female stranger in broad daylight. Her testimony placed him behind the wheel of the silver minivan and, most importantly, with the murder weapon in his possession. She was the living proof of his predatory intentions. Next, the prosecution presented the unshakable physical. Forensic experts explained the science of ballistics, demonstrating to the jury how the microscopic markings on the shell casings from the 2014 crime scene were a definitive match to the suspect's .22 caliber pistol. They made it clear that this was not a matter of opinion, but of scientific fact. The gun that killed Rebecca Bletch was the same gun found in the suspect's van. Finally, the prosecution took the jury inside the suspect's mind. They presented the digital evidence recovered from his computer. The jury saw the folder named VIX. They saw the subfolder meticulously labeled RSB. This evidence was devastating. It dismantled any notion that the killing was a random, impulsive act. It showed a man who collected and cataloged his victims like trophies. It proved a direct, obsessive, and proprietary interest in the victim, Rebecca Bletch. The data demonstrated a clear pattern of premeditation and a dark fantasy life that he had actively worked to turn into reality. The defense attorneys were in a difficult position. They argued that the evidence was purely circumstantial. They pointed out that no one saw Jeffrey Willis shoot Rebecca Bletch. They attempted to create reasonable doubt by suggesting that other people had access to his home and his van, and that someone else could have borrowed his gun. They tried to portray the contents of his computer as nothing more than dark fantasies, separate from his real-world actions. The jury was not convinced. After a 2-week trial, they began their deliberations on November 2, 2017. In a testament to the overwhelming strength of the prosecution's case, it took them just over an to reach a unanimous decision. The foreman announced the verdict: guilty of first-degree, premeditated murder, and guilty of felony firearm possession. Throughout the reading of the verdict, the suspect showed no emotion. He sat stone-faced, staring forward, as if he were hearing about someone else's life. On December 18, 2017, he appeared for his sentencing. The victim's family delivered powerful impact statements, speaking of their profound loss and the 2 years they spent in agonizing uncertainty. The judge, calling the suspect's actions predatory and disgusting, handed down the only sentence possible for his crime: mandatory life in prison, with no possibility of parole. This was not the end of his legal troubles. The suspect would later be convicted for the kidnapping of the teenager, receiving an additional sentence for that crime. And in May of 2018, he was put on trial again, this time for the 2013 murder of Jessica Hearing. Based on the digital evidence from the JAISH folder and other corroborating facts, he was found guilty and received a second life sentence. With the legal battles concluded, a fuller picture of the killer emerged. Jeffrey Willis was the classic example of a predator hiding in plain sight. He had no prior criminal record. He was a long-time employee at a local office furniture company. He was married, had children, and lived a quiet, unremarkable life in a suburban neighborhood. But beneath this facade of normalcy was a meticulous and patient sexual predator whose violent fantasies had escalated over years. The prosecution's theory was that his motive in Rebecca Bletch's case was sexual assault. They believe he attempted to abduct her during her run, but she fought back. Realizing his plan had failed and that he could be identified, he shot her to eliminate the only witness. The murder was not the plan. It was the violent cover-up of a failed kidnapping. The case sent a shockwave of fear and disbelief through the Muskegon community. The idea that a man so seemingly ordinary could be responsible for such heinous acts was deeply unsettling. But from the tragedy, the victim's family fought for a lasting, positive change. They became advocates for a new piece of legislation in Michigan. Previously, individuals applying for a concealed pistol license did not need to be re-fingerprinted if their prints were already in the state's system. The Blech family championed a bill that would close this loophole. In 2017, Rebecca Blech's law was signed, requiring fresh fingerprints for every new concealed carry application, ensuring the most up-to-date background checks possible. Even with the killer behind bars for life, troubling questions remain. The sheer volume of disturbing material on his computers and his years of covertly filming women have led investigators to believe that there could be other victims who have not yet been identified. And the role of his cousin, who was convicted of being an accessory after the fact in the Hiringa case, suggests that others may have known something about his dark activity. Ultimately, the complex web of crimes committed by Jeffrey Willis was unraveled because of one teenager's incredible courage. Her will to survive, her decision to jump from a moving van, was the single act that brought a hidden monster into the light. It gave a name to the man who had haunted 3 families and an entire community, and finally brought a measure of justice to the memory of Rebecca Blech. Case 7. Brentwood was the kind of small town that felt insulated from the harsh realities of the outside world. It was a community built on familiar faces, neighborhood barbecues, and the comforting rhythm of seasons changing. Here, crime was something seen on the evening news, happening in distant cities, not on their own tree-lined streets. In the heart of this community was Emily Weston, a 32-year-old elementary school teacher who embodied the town's spirit of warmth and dedication. To her students at Brentwood Elementary, she was more than an educator. She was a mentor and a source of constant encouragement. She was known for staying late to tutor children who were falling behind and for organizing extracurricular activities that made learning feel like an adventure. Her passion wasn't confined to the classroom. The victim was an active participant in the town's community center, volunteering her time for local events and helping to organize fundraisers. She lived a quiet, modest life on her own in a 2-bedroom house on the edge of town. While her personal life remained private, her friendly demeanor and willingness to help anyone in need made her a beloved figure. Neighbors described her as the type of person who would always remember your birthday and would be the first to offer a helping hand if you were carrying in groceries. She was, in every sense, a pillar of the small Brentwood community. But the peaceful rhythm of her life had been disturbed in the months leading up to January of 2002. For nearly 2 years, the victim had been engaged to a man named Michael Davis. From the outside, they appeared to be a happy couple, but beneath the surface, issues had been growing. A few months before the murder, Emily had made the difficult decision to end the engagement. The breakup was described by her friends as challenging but necessary. Michael Davis, a 34-year-old accountant, did not handle the separation well. He seemed incapable of accepting that the relationship was over. This inability to cope with rejection began to manifest in unsettling ways. His grief and disappointment curdled into a dangerous obsession. He started appearing, uninvited, at places he knew the victim would be: a grocery store aisle, the local park where she sometimes walked, even the parking lot of her school. His presence was a constant, unnerving shadow she couldn't seem to shake. The harassment extended beyond physical appearances. He sent her a barrage of text messages, often repetitive and pleading, that continued long after she had asked him to stop. Compounding his emotional instability was a significant professional crisis. Just a few months before the murder, the former fiancé had lost his job at a local accounting. An internal audit had uncovered financial discrepancies in records he was responsible for, and his employment was terminated. This loss of career and reputation seemed to push him further into isolation and amplified his fixation on the victim. Friends and acquaintances described him as becoming more withdrawn, a man struggling to accept failure in any aspect of his life. Emily Weston, though a private person, could not completely hide the strain she was under. Her colleagues at the school noticed a change. She seemed more anxious, more on edge, particularly when the subject of her ex-fiancé came up. They noted her growing unease around him, describing his public persona as polite but distant, yet they could sense the deeper tension. In an attempt to move on with her life, the victim had quietly started a new relationship. She kept the details to herself, likely to protect her new partner and herself from a potential drama with her ex-fiancé. But for a man like Michael Davis, the idea that she was moving on was likely an unbearable thought. This was the backdrop leading to the cold morning of January 15, 2002. The day began like any other Tuesday at Brentwood Elementary. The yellow school buses pulled up to the curb, and the sounds of children's laughter filled the crisp winter air. Teachers greeted their students, and the morning bell rang, signaling the start of classes. But in one classroom, the students sat waiting. Their teacher, a woman who was never late, was not there. The initial quiet confusion among the children slowly grew into a palpable sense of concern among the faculty. It was completely out of character for Emily Weston to be absent without any notice. A colleague, worried by her unanswered calls, remembered that she had a close relationship with her next-door neighbor, an elderly woman named Gloria Reynolds. A phone call was made around lunchtime, a simple request to check in, a hope that perhaps the victim had just overslept or was feeling unwell. This single phone call would set in motion the discovery of a tragedy that would shatter Brentwood's sense of security forever. A neighbor promised she would walk over and check on her friend right away. A neighbor, a kind-hearted elderly woman named Gloria Reynolds, had always felt a protective fondness for the young teacher living next door. The two had developed a close friendship, a bond of mutual watchfulness and care. So, when she received the call from the victim's colleague, a knot of worry tightened in her stomach. She put on her coat and walked the few familiar steps to Emily Weston's front door. She knocked first, a polite, rhythmic tap. There was no answer. She called out the victim's name, her voice carrying a slight tremor of concern. The silence that answered was heavy, unnatural. She tried the doorknob, expecting it to be locked. To her surprise, it turned. The door was unlatched, pushed open just a crack. This was the first, jarring sign that something was terribly wrong. Summoning her courage, the neighbor pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The scene that greeted her was one of chaos. The living room, normally a neat and tidy space, was in disarray. A coffee table was overturned, its contents spilled across the rug. Books had been swept from their shelves and were scattered across the floor. It was immediately clear that a violent struggle had taken place. Her eyes scanned the wreckage, and then she saw it. In the far corner of the room, partially obscured by an armchair, lay the still, silent figure of Emily Weston. A dark pool of blood had formed a halo around her head. Her face was marked by the unmistakable trauma of a brutal, forceful attack. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The neighbor's breath caught in her throat, a strangled gasp of horror and disbelief. Then, her training from years of community safety meetings kicked in. She backed out of the house, careful not to touch anything, pulled out her cell phone with trembling hands, and dialed 911. Within minutes, the quiet suburban street was filled with the piercing sound of sirens. Police cruisers and an ambulance arrived, their flashing lights casting an eerie red and blue glow against the peaceful facades of the neighboring houses. The first responding officers secured the home, cordoning it off with yellow tape that seemed to scream a warning to the entire town. A perimeter was established, and the methodical process of a homicide investigation began. Leading the investigation was Detective Sarah Thompson of the Brentwood Police Department. She was a seasoned investigator with over 15 years on the force, known for her calm demeanor and a meticulous eye for detail that missed nothing. As she stepped across the threshold of the victim's home, she absorbed the scene not with the shock of a neighbor, but with the analytical gaze of a professional. Her first observations were critical. There were no signs of a forced entry. The door had been ajar, but the lock was not broken, nor were there any marks on the frame. The victim's car was still parked in the driveway. These initial facts suggested the attacker was either someone the victim knew and had let inside, or someone who had caught her completely by surprise. Detective Thompson's next assessment focused on the motive. A walkthrough of the house quickly dispelled the theory of a robbery gone wrong. While the living room was a scene of violence, the rest of the house was relatively untouched. A purse sat on the kitchen counter, its contents intact. Electronic equipment and other valuables were all in their proper places. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, it was personal. The disarray in the living room spoke not of a frantic search for valuables, but of a desperate fight for life. The overturned furniture and scattered belongings were evidence of the victim's resistance against her attacker. And then, Detective Thompson saw the clue that would define the entire course of the investigation. Lying on the floor, not far from the victim's body, was a shattered picture frame. The glass was cracked, the wooden frame split at the corner. It had clearly been knocked down during the struggle. But it was the photograph inside that immediately captured the detective's full attention. It was a picture of a smiling Emily Weston, standing beside her former fiancé, Michael Davis. In a room full of chaos, this single object provided a sudden, sharp focus. It was the first tangible link between the violence in the room and the victim's troubled past. The investigation now had a name and a direction. As the forensics team began their painstaking work of collecting evidence from the scene, Detective Thompson initiated the next phase of the investigation, gathering information. Detectives were dispatched to interview the victim's friends, family, and colleagues. A consistent and tragic story began to emerge. They all confirmed the recent, difficult breakup of the victim's 2-year engagement. They spoke of how her ex-fiancé had struggled to accept it. Several colleagues recounted specific instances of his obsessive behavior, noting that the victim had grown increasingly worried about him in the months before her death. They painted a picture of a man who was fixated, whose public demeanor of being polite but distant masked a much darker current of possessiveness. Simultaneously, a background check was run on Michael Davis. The results provided crucial context to the testimony being gathered. Investigators confirmed that he had recently lost his job as an accountant under a cloud of suspicion regarding financial misconduct. This professional failure, combined with the personal rejection from his former fiancée, suggested a man whose life was unraveling, a man who may have felt he had nothing left to lose. He was becoming more and more isolated, retreating from social circles and stewing in his own perceived victimhood. Every piece of information collected in those first criticals pointed in the same direction. The lack of forced entry, the personal nature of the violence, the broken photograph at the scene, and the consistent testimony from those who knew the victim best, it all constructed a compelling narrative. The primary suspect was not a stranger who had broken in from the shadows, but a man who had once been the center of the victim's life. With a clear suspect in their sights, the investigation shifted its focus entirely onto the ex-fiancé, Michael Davis. The next step was to find out what secrets his own home might hold. With a signed search warrant in hand, Detective Thompson and her team descended on the apartment of Michael Davis. What they found inside provided a chilling window into the mind of an obsessed man. The home was not the chaotic lair of a madman, but rather a meticulously kept space that felt unnervingly normal, which only made the evidence they discovered more disturbing. In his closet, tucked away in a box, they found several of the victim's personal belongings, items she had never given him permission to take. Among them was a silk scarf, a small token of a life he refused to let go of. They also found an old letter she had written to him during their engagement, its edges worn from repeated readings. It was clear he was living in the past, clinging to a version of their relationship that no longer existed. The most damning evidence, however, was found in his bedside table. Detectives uncovered a handwritten note in which the suspect expressed his desperate desire to reconcile with the victim, stating that he would do anything to get her back. Alongside it was a journal. Its pages were filled with entries detailing his growing sense of betrayal and anger. He wrote about his belief that the victim had moved on too quickly, that she had wronged him, that she owed him an explanation, owed him another chance. The writings were a portrait of a man consumed by a toxic sense of entitlement and resentment. The evidence was overwhelming. The items from the victim, the notes, the journal, they transformed the suspect from a person of interest into the undeniable prime suspect. With this mountain of evidence, Michael Davis was brought in for interrogation. First, he maintained his composure, denying any involvement. He was calm, articulate, and portrayed himself as a heartbroken man who was also grieving the loss of his former love. But Detective Thompson was patient. She and her team methodically presented him with the evidence. They spoke of the witness statements, of his obsessive texts, of his stalking behavior. Then, they laid out the items found in his apartment, the scarf, the letter, the journal. Faced with the physical proof of his own fixation, his calm facade began to crumble. After a long, tense interrogation, the suspect finally broke. He confessed to the murder of Emily West. His confession filled in the final, brutal details of that Tuesday morning. He admitted he had gone to her house with the intention of making one last plea for them to get back together. He truly believed he had a right to another chance and could not process her refusal to give him one. When the victim had once again, calmly but firmly, rejected him, his lifetime of frustration and his inability to handle rejection erupted into an uncontrollable rage. In that moment, he saw her not as the woman he once loved, but as the source of all his failures, the loss of his job, his happiness, his future. Blinded by fury, he grabbed a heavy metal object and attacked her, striking her repeatedly in the head. He recounted her attempts to flee and how he had ruthlessly overpowered her. His confession also revealed a chilling detail that would be crucial in court. He acknowledged that his actions were driven by a long-simmering resentment. This was not a sudden, unpredictable snap. It was the culmination of months of obsession, entitlement, and a dark conviction that if he couldn't have her, then no one could. The trial of Michael Davis began in the late summer of 2002. His defense team argued that the killing was a crime of passion. They attempted to portray him as a mentally fragile man, pushed to the brink by emotional distress, who had acted in a spontaneous burst of anger after being rejected one final time. The prosecution, led by the district attorney, vehemently refuted this claim. They argued that the suspect's actions were methodical and premeditated. They presented the jury with the timeline of his escalating obsession, the text messages, the phone records, the journal entries that chronicled his rage. The forensic evidence showed that the blows to the victim's head were delivered with a calculated and vicious force, inconsistent with a momentary loss of control. The prosecution painted a picture not of a crime of passion, but of a cold, deliberate act of domestic violence, the final, terrible act of a controlling and possessive man. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned with its verdict. They found Michael Davis guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. The gavel fell, and the legal chapter of the case closed, but the story was far from over. The murder of Emily Weston left a permanent scar on the town of Brentwood. The crime shattered the community's cherished sense of safety, forcing residents to confront the dark reality that monsters don't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes, they are the people you know. The case sparked a difficult but necessary town-wide conversation about the dangers of obsession, emotional abuse, and the warning signs that are too often ignored. In the wake of the tragedy, support groups were formed. Local schools began implementing educational programs on healthy relationships, hoping to prevent a future tragedy. The case also had a profound personal impact on Detective Sarah Thompson. She was haunted by the thought that there were clear warning signs that the community, and perhaps even law enforcement, had failed to take seriously enough. She dedicated a portion of her career to studying patterns of obsessive behavior and became a leading voice in community workshops designed to educate the public about the red flags of emotional abuse. And while her life was tragically cut short, the legacy of Emily Weston endured. A scholarship fund was established in her name at Brentwood Elementary, ensuring that her dedication to education would continue to help students for years to come. Her former students, now grown, continued to honor her memory through acts of kindness and a shared commitment to learning. One of them even started an after-school tutoring program inspired by her, keeping her generous spirit alive. The town of Brentwood would never forget the teacher they had lost, a woman whose life was a testament to kindness, and whose death became a tragic but powerful catalyst for change.